Hey there, and welcome back. However the day has used you, that is over now, and your only task is to set the whole of it down, to let the warmth gather close, and to let your mind drift loose and unhurried. So, settle yourself. Let each breath come a little slower than the one before, and let me lead you back across more than 5 centuries to the life of a woman whom history has almost forgotten, though she lived through the heart of its greatest storm. Tonight our story belongs to a woman who was born one of the richest heiresses in all of England, who became a countess in her own right while still young, and whose vast inheritance made her husband the most powerful subject the kingdom had ever known. Her blood made kings and unmade them. Her wealth bought armies, and when the storm she had been caught up in finally broke, it carried away her husband, her 2 daughters, and the men who had married them, one after another, until she alone was left standing among the ruins. Her name was Anne Beauchamp, Countess of Warwick, and she has a claim to be the greatest survivor of that whole terrible age. There is a scene we are travelling toward tonight, far down the road, in which this woman, grown old, sits in the shelter of an abbey and writes to a king she has never trusted, begging for the return of the lands that were hers by birthright, lands that had been taken from her by a law that declared her dead while she still drew breath. How a living woman came to be ruled legally deceased, and how she outlasted even that, is one of the strangest things you will hear. But that lies a long way ahead of us, in the small hours. We have her whole life to live through first. Before we step into her world, there is one small thing I would mention. I always like to learn who has joined me at this late hour, so if you are so minded, leave a few words below telling me where in the world you have settled tonight, and what the clock reads where you sit. I do read through what you leave, and there is a quiet gladness in imagining all those far-apart rooms, lamps low, each one given over for a while to the same old story as the dark draws in. And if this sort of slow journey into a vanished century is something you would like to come back to, the subscribe button is there whenever you wish it, under no obligation at all, and another of these unhurried nights will reach you before long. That is everything. The rest of the hours are hers now. Picture this: a castle on the banks of a river in the green heart of England, on a summer day in the year 1426, its grey walls warm in the light, the water moving slow and bright below, and within its chambers, the household of one of the greatest noblemen in the land, going quietly about its work. This is Caversham, a residence of the Earls of Warwick, and on this July day, a daughter is born here to the Earl and his wife. She is not the heir. She has an elder half-sister or two, a brother who will carry on the line, and her arrival is a matter of modest note rather than great rejoicing. One more child of a great house. Yet she is born into wealth almost beyond reckoning, the daughter of Richard Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, one of the foremost men of the kingdom, a soldier and a statesman of European renown, and of his wife Isabel, who carried in her own veins the blood of kings. The child in the cradle at Caversham is heiress to nothing yet, a younger child in a house full of life. But death, in that age, was never far from any door, and a chain of it, link by link, would one day make this ordinary noble infant into one of the wealthiest women in England and a countess in her own right. None of that could be seen, that summer day by the river. There was only a new daughter of the House of Warwick, born to comfort and to greatness, at the beginning of a life that would carry her through more sorrow and more endurance than anyone bending over her cradle could ever have foreseen. To understand the woman she became, we must first understand the blood she carried, for Anne Beauchamp was born to one of the most distinguished inheritances in the kingdom. Her father, Richard Beauchamp, was no ordinary nobleman. He was a soldier of European fame, a man who had fought and jousted across Christendom, who had served as a captain in the long wars in France, who had even been given the keeping of the captured Joan of Arc in her final months. He was cultured and devout and immensely wealthy, the very model of what a medieval lord was supposed to be, and his name was known and respected from London to Rome. To be the child of such a man was to be born among the very highest of the English nobility, surrounded from birth by the trappings of greatness, raised in castles and noble houses, accustomed from infancy to wealth and deference and an unshakable consciousness of high blood. Her mother gave her something rarer still. Isabel le Despencer came of a line that reached back, through a tangle of noble marriages, to the royal house itself, to the blood of King Edward III, through his son the Duke of York. In Anne's veins, then, ran two great streams, the Beauchamp inheritance, with its earldom and its vast estates, and the Despencer blood, ancient and proud and touched with royalty. She was, from the moment of her birth, a person of consequence, a daughter of two great houses, and though she could not yet know it, the wealth and the blood she carried would one day make her the most sought-after prize in England, and would draw upon her, in time, both the heights of fortune and the depths of grief. It is worth dwelling on the father a little longer, for the shadow of so famous a man would have lain over his daughter's whole sense of herself. Richard Beauchamp was, in his day, one of the most admired men in Europe, the very pattern of chivalry, a soldier and a diplomat and a patron of the arts, whose fame reached far beyond England. He had travelled widely, fought in distant lands, jousted before kings, and won a reputation for prowess and courtesy that made his name a byword for noble virtue. He was entrusted with great offices, including the guardianship and education of the young King of England himself, a mark of the immense trust the realm placed in him. To be the daughter of such a man was to grow up in the light of a famous reputation, to carry a title that opened every door and commanded respect throughout the kingdom and beyond. It would have shaped her sense of who she was, this consciousness of belonging to so distinguished a house, of being the child of a man whose renown was a kind of inheritance in itself. And it would have raised the stakes of everything that followed, for a daughter of the famous Earl of Warwick was no ordinary woman to be married off and forgotten. She was a person of consequence by her very birth, a prize whose value lay not only in her lands, but in the lustre of her lineage. When the chain of deaths made her the heir to all of it, the title and the lands and the proud Beauchamp blood, she inherited not merely a fortune, but the weight of a famous reputation, the duty to carry forward the honour of a celebrated line. She bore it through every trial of her life, through greatness and ruin alike, and at the end she was laid to rest among the Beauchamps, a daughter of the house to the last. The father's fame had given her a fine inheritance and a proud name, and though the inheritance was stolen from her, the name was hers to the grave, the one thing that not even an Act of Parliament could take away. There is a thread of bitter irony in how close Anne's family stood to the crown across the generations, for that very closeness, which seemed at each turn a blessing, proved again and again to be a curse. Her father had been entrusted with the care and schooling of a young king, a mark of the deepest trust the crown could give. Her husband would make and unmake kings. Her younger child would wear a crown. Her grandson and granddaughter would carry the blood of kings in their veins. At point after point, the family brushed against the throne, drawn toward it as the great are drawn toward the center of power. And each time, that proximity to the crown brought not security, but danger. Her father's service to the crown was an honor, but the wars that followed swallowed the family whole. Her husband's king-making raised them to the heights, and then destroyed them. Her daughter's crown was a triumph that ended in early death. Her grandchildren's royal blood marked them out for the suspicion of kings and led them to the scaffold. It is as though the throne were a kind of flame, and her family the moths drawn to it, dazzled by its brightness and consumed by its heat. To stand close to the crown in that age was to stand close to the greatest danger in the land, for the crown was the prize over which the whole bloody contest was fought, and those who reached for it, or stood near those who did, were caught up in the killing. Anne's family reached for it, again and again, and was burned, again and again, until almost nothing of it remained. And Anne herself, who reached for nothing, who only inherited the blood and the lands that drew the danger down, was burned along with the rest, her quiet life consumed in the fire that her family's nearness to the throne had kindled. The crown that the family circled so closely gave them, in the end, not greatness but ruin, and Anne paid for that fatal proximity as fully as any of them, though she had done nothing to seek it, but be born into a house that stood too near the throne. One thinks in this connection of how differently her life might have run had she been born to a lesser house, with smaller lands and no royal blood, and no place near the dangerous centre of power. Such a woman might have lived out her days in quiet obscurity, married to a country lord, raising her children in peace, untroubled by the great convulsions that tore the kingdom. It was the very greatness of her birth, the wealth and the blood, and the proximity to the throne that drew the storm down upon her, that made her husband a maker of kings and her daughters, the pawns of dynastic ambition, and her grandchildren the targets of suspicious monarchs. Her tragedy was, in a sense, the tragedy of being born too high, too close to the centre, too richly endowed with the things that the great fought over. A humbler birth might have given her a happier life, but it would not have given us her story, and her story, for all its sorrow, is one worth the having, a window onto the human cost of greatness in a violent age, and a portrait of one woman's almost unimaginable endurance through it all. It is worth pausing over that maternal inheritance, the dispenser blood, for it carried both glory and a shadow. The Dispensers were a family that had climbed to dizzying heights in an earlier age and had paid a terrible price for it. Anne's forebears on her mother's side included men who had been the favourites and the power behind a king, who had gathered to themselves vast wealth and vaster resentment, and who had ended, more than one of them, on the scaffold or worse, when the wheel of royal favour turned against them. It was a lineage that knew in its very bones how swiftly fortune could lift a family to the summit and how brutally it could cast them down. And that knowledge was, in a sense, Anne's birthright as much as the lands and the blood. Through her mother, she was also descended by a winding path of noble marriages from the old royal house itself, from one of the sons of a great king, so that the blood of kings ran thin but real in her veins. This royal descent was a source of pride and standing, the kind of thing that was remembered and recited, and that raised a family above its merely wealthy neighbours. But it was also, in the dangerous arithmetic of the age, a source of peril, for blood that reached back toward the throne could make its bearers objects of suspicion, in unsettled times, rivals to be watched, claims to be feared. Anne could not have known, as a girl, how heavily that double inheritance would weigh upon her own descendants, how the very blood that exalted them would mark them for destruction. But the pattern was already there in her ancestry, written into the rise and fall of the Dispensers. That greatness and danger were two faces of the same coin, and that those who carried the highest blood often paid the highest price. She was born to all of it, the glory and the shadow alike. Her mother, Isabel le Despencer, deserves a moment of her own, for she was a woman of consequence, and her own life cast a kind of shadow forward onto the next generation. Isabel was twice married and twice widowed, and through her flowed not only the proud and dangerous Despencer name, but the thread of royal descent that gave Anne her drop of king's blood. She was a great heiress in her own right, as her child would be, and she knew, as the younger woman would learn, what it was to be a woman of property in a world ruled by men, valued for her lands and her blood, her marriages arranged for the advantage of others. There is a continuity between the two women here that is worth marking. Both were heiresses, both carried vast inheritances, both were prizes in the marriage market of the nobility, both lived lives shaped by forces they did not control. Isabel died not long after the child, who would become so famous a survivor, was already grown and married, and she did not live to see the heights to which her daughter's inheritance would carry the family, nor the depths to which its loss would later cast her down. But in her own life, she had already traced, in fainter outline, the pattern her child would live out on a grander and more terrible scale. The heiress whose blood and lands made her valuable, whose fate was bound up with the men she married, whose greatness was also a kind of vulnerability. Anne inherited from her mother not only the dispenser blood and the touch of royalty, but in a sense the whole condition of the wealthy heiress, with all its privilege and all its peril. The daughter would carry that inheritance further and suffer for it more than the mother ever did. But the line ran true from one to the other. The same blood, the same lot, the same hard truth, that for a woman in that world, to be a glittering prize was to be, forever, at the mercy of those who wished to win her. The dispenser ancestry carried with it a cautionary history that, looking back, seems almost to foreshadow the fate of the family Anne would marry into. The Despensers had been, generations before, among the most powerful men in England, the favourites and the right hands of a king, gathering to themselves such wealth and such authority that they overreached, made enemies of the great, and were destroyed in a storm of vengeance, dying terrible deaths when the wheel of royal favour turned against them. It was a classic tale of the age, the family that rose too high and fell too far, that grasped at too much power and was annihilated for it. And it is hard, knowing what came after, not to see in that old dispenser tragedy a kind of pattern that would repeat itself in Anne's own family. Her husband, too, rose to dizzying heights of power, overreached, made enemies of kings, and was destroyed. Her grandson and her granddaughter, carrying the proud blood she had passed on, would be cut down by suspicious monarchs who feared their lineage. The pattern of the Despensers, the rise too high and the catastrophic fall, seems woven into the very blood she carried, repeating across the generations, exalting her family and then destroying it. There is something almost fated about it. This recurring tragedy of a bloodline that climbed toward the throne and was again and again struck down for climbing. She herself was the great exception, in a sense, for she rose high and fell far, but was not destroyed. She survived, where so many of her blood, before and after, did not. But she could not pass that gift of survival on to her descendants, who inherited instead the old dispenser fate, the doom of the too highly born, and were destroyed in their turn. The blood that gave her family its greatness carried within it, it seems, the seed of its ruin, an ancient pattern of rise and fall that played itself out across the centuries, and that she alone, of all her line, managed for a while to escape. She was still a small child when her future was decided for her, as the futures of all great heiresses were decided by the calculations of her elders. Anne was 8 years old when she was betrothed to a boy of 6, a younger son of another great northern family, the Nevilles. His name was Richard Neville, and one day the world would know him by a far more famous title. There was nothing unusual in such an arrangement. The marriages of noble offspring were matters of property and alliance, settled by parents and guardians long before the young people themselves had any say or any understanding of what was being done. 2 years after the betrothal, when she was about 10 years old, the marriage itself was solemnized, and it was solemnized in the grandest possible way, in a double wedding that bound the two families together with a double knot. For on the same day that Anne Beauchamp was wed to Richard Neville, her own brother Henry, the heir to the Earldom of Warwick, was married to Richard's sister Cecily. 2 of the Beauchamp married to 2 of the Nevilles in a single ceremony. The houses of Beauchamp and Neville joined twice over in one day. It was a grand occasion, a knitting together of 2 of the most powerful families in England, and at its centre stood a girl of 10 and a boy of 8, solemnly made husband and wife. They were far too young, of course, for the marriage to be anything more than a legal bond. They would grow into it over the years that followed, two children betrothed in the cradle of their world's expectations. But the knot was tied, and it would hold for the rest of their lives, through triumph and disaster alike, until death itself untied it on a fog-bound battlefield 35 years away. It is worth lingering on the world of her earliest years, the years before the deaths and the wars, for they were perhaps the only truly secure season of her whole long life. She was born into a household at the very height of its fortunes, the daughter of a famous and powerful father, raised in the proud castles of a powerful family, surrounded by every comfort and consequence the age could provide. As a small girl, before the chain of deaths transformed her prospects, she would have been one daughter among several, a child of the house, with no particular weight of destiny upon her, free perhaps to be simply a girl in a noble household, learning the things that noble girls learned, the management of a household, the accomplishments expected of a lady, the devotions of her faith. Those early years at Caversham and the other family houses would have had a settled quality that nothing in her later life would match. A girlhood lived in the calm before any storm, in a family still whole, still rising, still untouched by the catastrophes to come. Her father still lived, famous and admired. Her brother still lived, the bright heir of the house. The wars that would consume them all were still in the future, gathering perhaps, but not yet fallen. And the little girl who would become the great survivor was for those few early years simply a child of a fortunate house, safe in a world that had not yet begun to take everything from her. There is a poignancy in imagining her so, the small girl in the high-walled castle, before the deaths began, before she knew what her life would ask her to endure. She could not have known, in those secure early years, that she would outlive them all, that the whole bright world of her girlhood would be swept away, that she would be the one left standing when everyone and everything she knew in those first years was gone. For the moment she was simply a daughter of the house, secure and cared for, and as yet unmarked by sorrow. It was the last time her life would be so simple. Everything after would be greatness and grief, rise and ruin, the long hard road of her extraordinary endurance. But it began, as all lives begin, in a girlhood, and hers, for a few short years, was a fortunate one, in a great house, in the calm before the storm that would define the rest of her days. We might pause, too, on a simple human truth that her story makes vivid, that the towering figures of history, the kings and the kingmakers whose deeds fill the chronicles, did not stand alone, but were surrounded always by others whose lives their ambitions shaped and often destroyed. Behind the famous man was a wife. Behind the great house were the daughters married off, to seal its alliances. Behind the rise to power were the people who would fall with it. We are apt, reading of the past, to fix our gaze on the central figures, the ones who acted and decided, and to forget the others gathered around them. The women and children and dependents whose fortunes rose and fell with the mighty without their ever having chosen it. Her life draws our eye to those others, to the ones who lived in the shadow of the mighty and paid the price of their ambitions. She was, for most of her life, exactly such a figure. The woman behind the famous man, valued for the blood and the lands she brought him, carried along by designs she had no part in shaping. To tell her story is to turn the light, for a moment, away from the central actors and onto one of the many who stood behind them, and in doing so, to see the great events of the age from a different angle, from the vantage of those who suffered them rather than those who caused them. It is a vantage worth taking, for it reminds us that history is lived not only by the few who shape it, but by the many who are shaped by it, and that their stories, quieter and sadder and less remembered, are as real and as worth the telling as the louder tales of the men at the centre. Let us pause on what such a childhood betrothal actually meant for a girl like Anne, for it is easy to pass over these arrangements as mere matters of property and miss the human strangeness of them. Betrothed at 8, married at 10, she was a child, by any reckoning, when the most important decision of her life was made entirely without her, and made not once but bindingly, sealing her future before she had any future she could imagine for herself. She would have understood, as far as a child can understand such things, that she now had a husband, that this small boy a couple of years her junior was the person to whom her life was tied, that the two of them would one day, when they were grown, live together as man and wife, and carry on the joined fortunes of their families. There would have been no question of love in it, no courtship, no choosing. There was only the fact of the arrangement, settled by her elders, as fixed and unremarkable to those grown folk as the inheritance of a manor. And yet these child marriages were not always cold things in the end. Anne and her boy husband would grow up together, in a sense, would come to know each other across the years, and whatever began as a bloodless transaction between families could ripen, over a lifetime shared, into something like partnership and even affection. We have no window into Anne's heart on the matter, no letters in which she confides whether she came to love the husband chosen for her in the cradle. But they remained married for 35 years, through every storm their world could throw at them, and she kept faith with his cause and his memory to the end of her own long life, returning at the last to lie beside him in the grave. Whatever it had been at its beginning, the bond forged at that double wedding proved, in its way, one of the most durable things in her entire existence. And consider the long, slow growing together that followed the vows, for the marriage made between two children in that grand double ceremony had decades to ripen before the storms came. Anne and her boy husband were wed when she was about 10, and he a little younger, far too young for the marriage to be anything but a legal bond. But they had years ahead of them, years of growing up side by side, of growing into their inheritance together, of learning to be husband and wife as they passed from childhood into youth, and from youth into the full responsibilities of their station. We know almost nothing of the private texture of that marriage, for the records keep their usual silence about such things, but we can see its outline in the bare facts. They were married for some 35 years. They had 2 daughters together. They climbed to the very summit of the kingdom as a couple, he wielding the power that her inheritance provided, she keeping the houses and raising the children and managing the estates while he was about the high affairs of the realm. It was, by the measure of the age, a successful partnership, a marriage that worked as such marriages were meant to work, each playing the part assigned to their sex, together building and holding a position of enormous power. Whether there was love in it, in the sense we would mean, we cannot say, but there was surely a long partnership, a shared life, a knitting together over decades of 2 people who had been joined as children and who built something formidable between them. And when he died at Barnet, she did not cast off his memory or his cause. She kept faith with both, remained loyal to the family they had made together, and returned at the very end to lie beside him in the grave. Whatever their marriage had been across all those years, it held her loyalty to the last, and the bond made between 2 children in that double wedding proved one of the most enduring things in her long and storm-tossed life, outlasting in her faithfulness even the husband's death by more than 20 years. For the first years of her marriage, she was simply the wife of a younger son, a girl of good blood married into another good family with no particular expectation of greatness. Her brother Henry was the heir. The earldom of Warwick and the vast Beauchamp estates would pass to him, and through him to his children. Anne's portion would be respectable but secondary, the lot of a younger daughter who had married well enough. And then death began its work, and link by link, with a terrible patience, it remade her fortune entirely. The first blow fell in the year 1439, when her father, the great Earl, died far from home in France. Her brother Henry succeeded to the earldom, a young man with his whole life before him and was even raised higher still, created a duke, the only Duke of Warwick there would ever be. It seemed the line was secure, but Henry did not live to enjoy his greatness. He died young in the year 1446, when he was barely 20, leaving behind a single small daughter, a little girl named Anne after her aunt, who became, in her cradle, Countess of Warwick in her own right. The whole vast inheritance now rested on the life of one infant, and that life too was brief. In the early summer of 1449, the little countess died, a child of 5, and with her death the direct line of the Beauchamps was extinguished, and the question of who should inherit the largest non-royal fortune in England suddenly had a new and startling answer. For the heir now was Anne. With her father dead, her brother dead, and her brother's only child dead, she found herself, at 22 years old, the sole surviving full heir to the entire Beauchamp and Despencer inheritance. The younger daughter, who had expected only a respectable portion, was transformed by that chain of deaths into one of the wealthiest women in all of England. She became Countess of Warwick in her own right, suo jure, as the lawyers said, holding the title and the lands by her own blood, rather than through any husband. And her husband, the younger son who had married her when they were children, was lifted up with her, becoming Earl of Warwick jure uxoris, by right of his wife. It was she who carried the greatness. He merely held it through her. Together, they were now one of the richest couples in the kingdom, masters of land scattered across England and into Wales, with a yearly income reckoned in many thousands of pounds, a fortune to rival that of princes. The grey-walled castles, the broad lands, the rents of countless manors, the loyalty of thousands of tenants and followers, all of it was theirs, and at the root of all of it was Anne, the heiress whose blood had drawn the whole inheritance together into her 2 hands. She had become, almost overnight and entirely by the accident of who had died, the single most important key to power in the kingdom. And the man who held that key, through her, would use it to shake the throne of England itself. There is something worth pausing over in the sheer manner of Anne's elevation, for she did not earn her greatness, nor was it bestowed upon her as a gift. It fell to her through a succession of deaths, each one a grief, that happened to clear the path to her door. Consider the chain of it. Her father had to die, and did. Her brother, young and newly made a duke, with his whole life seemingly before him, had to die, and did, at barely 20. And then her brother's infant daughter, the little girl who became a countess in her cradle, the last barrier between Anne and the whole inheritance, had to die as well, a child of 5. And did only when all 3 of them were in their graves, did the great fortune come to rest in Anne's hands. She became one of the wealthiest women in England, not through any act of her own, but through the deaths of those she had loved, her greatness built, quite literally, upon their tombs. It is a strange and sobering thing to inherit in such a way, to receive one's fortune as the residue of family tragedy, and one wonders how Anne herself regarded it. We may wonder whether she felt the weight of those deaths behind her wealth. The brother lost so young, the small niece gone before she could even know what she had been born to. Or perhaps the age had so accustomed her to death, which came for the young and the old alike with terrible regularity, that she accepted her inheritance as simply the way fortune fell. We cannot know, but there is a grim foreshadowing in it, for the pattern by which Anne gained her greatness, the pattern of outliving those around her, of being the one left standing when others fell, would prove to be the pattern of her entire life. She came into her fortune by surviving her family, and she would leave the world the same way, the last one standing, having buried very nearly everyone she had ever known. Spare a thought, in particular, for the brother whose death opened the way, for Henry Beauchamp was no mere stepping stone in his sister's story, but a young man of bright promise, cut down at the very threshold of his life. He was the heir, the one on whom the family's hopes rested, raised up with every honour, even created a duke. The only Duke of Warwick there would ever be, a mark of the extraordinary favour in which the family stood. He and his sister had been close in age, had been married on the same day in that double wedding of their childhood, had grown up together as brother and sister of a proud house. And he died at barely 20, his promise unfulfilled, his honours barely tasted, leaving behind only a tiny daughter to carry the line. For her, the loss of her brother must have been a real grief. Whatever it later meant for her fortunes, the death of the companion of her childhood, the brother with whom she had been wed in that grand double ceremony, gone before he had even come into his prime. And then his little daughter, the infant who briefly held the title, died too. A child of 5, another small grief, another small coffin, in the chain of deaths that was carrying the inheritance to its new heir. We are apt, looking back, to see these deaths only as the steps by which the heiress rose to reduce the brother and the niece to mere links in the chain of her elevation. But yet they were people, loved and mourned. A young man of bright promise and a little girl of 5, and their deaths were tragedies before they were opportunities. She would have grieved them as a sister and an aunt before she ever profited from them as an heiress, and the greatness that came to her was soaked in the grief of those losses. It is worth remembering that, for it sets the tone of her whole life, that even her rise to fortune was built on sorrow, that her wealth fell to her through a succession of deaths in her own family, and that her greatness, from its very beginning, was inseparable from grief. The great inheritance did not come to Anne without a fight, for she was not her father's only child. The old Earl had been married twice, and by his first wife he had fathered 3 elder daughters, Anne's own half-sisters, women now grown and married to powerful men of their own. When the direct line failed and the inheritance fell to Anne, these 3 half-sisters were bitterly unwilling to see the whole vast fortune pass to their younger half-sister alone, and so they contested it, pressing their own claims to a slice of the Beauchamp lands. They were not without weapons in the fight, for they had married formidable husbands. One was the wife of the Earl of Shrewsbury, a famous soldier. Another had married into the Latimer branch of the Nevilles, and the third, Eleanor, was the wife of Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, one of the greatest and most controversial men in the kingdom. The dispute was fought through the courts and the council, claim and counterclaim, and in the end, the law came down in her favour. Being the full-blooded sister of the last Earl and aunt of the last little Countess, she was judged the rightful heir, and her husband succeeded in keeping the estates intact in their hands rather than seeing them divided. They had won, but the victory came at a lasting cost, for the bitterness of the dispute poisoned the relations between Anne's husband and the powerful Beauforts, and that enmity, sharpened by the quarrel over her lands, would feed into the deepening divisions that were beginning to split the kingdom apart. The fortune that had made Anne great had also made her a target, and the resentments it stirred would echo for years to come. The legal principle on which Anne's victory rested is worth understanding, for it was a fine and contested point, and the kingdom's peace would suffer for the way it fell out. The question was this: when a vast inheritance had no direct male heir, the law had to determine who should take it. By one reckoning, the strict rule of seniority, the eldest of the old Earl's daughters should have had the first claim, or the lands should have been shared out among all the daughters as co-heiresses, the half-sisters sharing with Anne. But there was another principle, and it was the one that prevailed, that Anne, as the full-blooded sister of the last Earl and the full-blooded aunt of the last little Countess, stood closer in blood to the most recent holders of the title than her half-sisters did, being only of the half-blood. On that reasoning the law found for Anne, and her husband was able to keep the whole inheritance together in their hands, undivided, rather than see it broken up between the claimants. It was a victory of enormous consequence, for an undivided inheritance meant undivided power, and undivided power was what made Anne's husband the colossus he became. Had the lands been shared out among the sisters, none of them singly would have held enough to shake a kingdom. Because they passed whole to her, her husband commanded a fortune that rivaled the crown's. But victories of that size are never without cost, and the cost here was lasting hatred. The half-sisters and their powerful husbands did not forgive being shut out, and the bitterest of them, the Beauforts, carried their resentment into the wider quarrels of the realm. The feud over Anne's inheritance became one of the many private hatreds that fed the great public catastrophe of the wars, one more private hatred among the nobility that helped to turn disagreement into bloodshed. Anne's fortune, in other words, did not only make her family great, it helped in its small way to set the realm alight. The bitterness that the inheritance dispute left behind is worth tracing a little further, for it shows how a private family quarrel could feed into the great public catastrophe that followed. The half-sister who lost the most and resented it the most was the wife of Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, one of the dominant figures of the realm in those years, and a man already locked in rivalry with Anne's husband over the direction of the kingdom. The quarrel over the Beauchamp inheritance gave that rivalry a sharp personal edge, a private grievance to inflame the public contest. When two of the greatest men in England were already circling one another for power and influence, a bitter dispute over a vast fortune between their wives was not a thing to cool the temperature. It is impossible to say how much the inheritance quarrel contributed to the wider breakdown, for the causes of the conflict were many and tangled. But it was one strand in the rope, one of the private hatreds that, woven together with 100 others, helped to bind the kingdom towards civil war. And there is a grim appropriateness in that, for it means that Anne's fortune, the very inheritance that made her great, was not only the source of her own later sufferings, but a minor contributor to the general catastrophe that engulfed them all. The wealth that should have been a blessing helped, in its way, to sow the discord that became the wars, and the wars in turn destroyed the family that the wealth had raised. There is a terrible circularity in it, the fortune breeding the enmity feeding the strife devouring the fortune and the family alike. She stood at the centre of that circle, the holder of the inheritance, whose contested descent helped to set the great families at one another's throats, and the ultimate victim of the wars that the quarrel helped to bring on. Her greatness and her ruin grew, in the end, from the same root, the vast inheritance that drew the whole storm down upon her and her house. Now mistress of one of the greatest fortunes in England, Anne settled into the life of a ruling countess, and it was an existence of immense responsibility as well as immense privilege. To be the lady of such an inheritance was not merely to enjoy wealth, it was to govern it. The Beauchamp and Despencer lands spread across the south and west of England, and far into the Welsh marches, a wide scattering of lordships and manors and castles, each with its own tenants, its own officers, its own revenues to be gathered and accounts to be kept. While her husband was increasingly drawn away into the great affairs of the realm, into politics and war and the making of kings, much of the running of this sprawling estate would have fallen to Anne herself, as it fell to the wives of powerful lords throughout the age. She would have overseen the running of her households, the dispensing of hospitality and charity, the oversight of a small army of servants and officials. She would have known the business of her estates, the rhythm of rents and harvests, the disputes between tenants, the upkeep of castles, and the provisioning of grand houses. It was demanding labour, the unshowy work of holding a vast inheritance in good order, and it was work that fell largely to the women of the nobility while their men were away. She was, by every account that has come down to us, equal to it. Those who have looked closely at her life describe her as intelligent, capable, and resilient, a woman of genuine ability, and the management of her wide inheritance through years of mounting turmoil would have called upon every ounce of those qualities. She was not merely the passive vessel of a fortune, she was its keeper, and a careful one. It is worth asking how we know anything at all about a woman so determinedly overshadowed by the men around her, for the answer tells us something about how such women survive, or fail to survive, in the memory of the world. Anne left no great archive of her own, no bundle of intimate letters in which we might hear her private voice. What we have of her comes mostly through the records of others, the dry legal documents of her inheritance and her dispossession, the chronicles that note the doings of her famous husband, the occasional glimpse in the accounts and petitions that mark the edges of her life. There survives, too, a remarkable illustrated record made by a chronicler attached to her family, who set down the line of the Earls of Warwick and their kin in words and pictures, and who wrote warmly of Anne as he wrote warmly of all his patrons. From such fragments, pieced together, historians have reconstructed the outline of her life and formed their judgment of her character. But it is reconstruction, and the woman herself remains, in the deepest sense, beyond our reach, glimpsed always through the records that others kept for their own purposes rather than heard in her own words. This is the common lot of medieval women, even the greatest of them, that they come down to us refracted through the concerns of the men who wrote the records, valued in the documents for their blood and their lands rather than for themselves. Their inner lives almost wholly lost. The bare events of her life we can trace with reasonable confidence. Her feelings about any of it, the real character behind the handful of conventional compliments the chroniclers paid her, must be guessed at from her deeds and from the sheer fact of her endurance. The private woman stayed private, as the silence around her testifies, and whatever she truly thought and felt went down with her into the abbey at Beauchamp. She bequeathed to history not an inner life we can read, but a long train of consequence and a record of survival that has few equals in that savage time. There survives one slight and touching trace of Anne that is worth holding up, for it shows us a rare glimpse of her, not as a pawn or a victim, but as a person, a mother, a keeper of things precious. It is known that she possessed a beautiful illustrated book of devotions, a richly made volume of the kind that great ladies treasured, commissioned long before by her own father, the famous old Earl. And it is known that she passed this book on to her younger child, the one who became a queen. Think of what that simple act tells us. Across all the storms of her life, the rises and the falls, the flights and the dispossessions, she kept this thing, this book made for her family, this object that linked her to her father and her own childhood. And at some point she gave it to her daughter, passing it down the female line from mother to child, a modest inheritance of beauty and devotion handed on when the great inheritance of lands and title had been torn away. There is something deeply human in it, something that cuts through all the politics and the tragedy to the ordinary tenderness of a mother and child, and a treasured book. The lands could be seized, the title legislated away, the fortune divided among grasping sons-in-law. But this precious thing she kept, and gave, an act of love and memory, entirely her own, untouched by the great machinery that stripped her of everything else. We have so little of the inner woman, so few glimpses of the woman behind the events. This is one of them, a mother handing her daughter a beautiful book, a thread of continuity and affection running through all the wreckage, a small act of keeping and giving that no act of Parliament could take away. It is worth treasuring, that detail, for it is one of the rare moments where we glimpse Anne not as history's victim, but as herself, one who loved her family and kept what was precious and passed it on, who amid all her losses held on to this one small thing and gave it, in love, to her child. If we try to draw together what little we can know into a portrait of the woman herself, a few things stand out, even through the silence of the records. She was, first, capable, a manager of estates and households who kept a vast inheritance in good order through years of turmoil, which argues intelligence and steadiness and a head for affairs. She was loyal, keeping faith with her husband's cause and memory through the long decades of her widowhood, returning at the last to lie beside him. She was resilient beyond the ordinary measure, enduring blow after blow that would have broken most, and emerging from each still able to go on. She was, by the few accounts that touch on her, diplomatic and intelligent, a woman who handled the difficult business of her life with skill and sense. And she was, at the very end, brave and tenacious, pressing her rights against a king when a lesser spirit would have given up. From these fragments emerges the outline of a formidable woman, not flamboyant, not a maker of grand gestures, but solid, capable, enduring, the kind of person who holds things together while the more dramatic figures around her rise and fall and destroy themselves. She was not the sort of woman the chronicles love to write about, for she did not lead armies or scheme for thrones or die spectacular deaths. She was the sort who endures, who manages, who survives, who keeps faith and holds on, and such women, though they make poor copy for the chroniclers, are very often the ones who truly hold a family and a world together. That, as far as we can tell across the centuries, is the kind of woman she was. Capable, loyal, resilient, intelligent, brave in the quiet way that endurance requires. A woman of real substance, whom history has unjustly reduced to a footnote in the story of her famous husband. She deserves better than that, and the woman who emerges, even from the scant record, is one well worth the knowing. And it is worth remembering that for all the documents and chronicles that touch her years, the woman herself remains, in the end, a presence felt more than seen, glimpsed in the shape of her actions and the long record of her endurance rather than heard in her own voice. We know what she did and what was done to her. We can trace the outline of her days with reasonable confidence, but the inner self, the private thoughts and feelings of the woman who lived through it all, are lost to us, sealed away in the silence that covers nearly all the women of her age. What we can do is honour the outline that remains and fill it, as far as we honestly may, with the human warmth that the bare facts imply, the grief of the mother, the loyalty of the wife, the resolve of the survivor, the dignity of the old woman pressing her rights against a king. These we may reasonably infer, and in inferring them we bring her a little back to us. Not as a full and knowable person, for that is beyond us, but as a human presence, real and suffering and enduring behind the dry record of her extraordinary life. Picture, for a moment, the actual texture of that working life, for it is easy to imagine a wealthy countess as a figure of pure leisure and to miss the sheer labour of her position. A holding on that scale was not a single place, but a sprawling enterprise. Dozens of manors and lordships scattered across many counties, each one a small world of its own, with land to be farmed, rents to be collected, courts to be held, officials to be appointed and watched. Holding such an inheritance together meant a ceaseless flow of business, letters to be written and read, accounts to be examined, disputes among tenants to be settled, stewards and bailiffs and receivers to be directed and held to their duties. The lady of the estate stood at the heart of a vast web of dependents, with hundreds upon hundreds of souls looking to her for their livelihood, their justice, their protection. And when her husband was away, which in Anne's case was very often, for he was forever about the great affairs of the kingdom, the burden of all this fell more heavily upon her. She would have presided over a great household that was itself like a small town, with its officers and servants and hangers-on, its kitchens and stables and chapels, its daily round of meals and prayers and business. She would have dispensed the hospitality and the charity that were expected of a noble house, received guests and petitioners alike, overseen the education and placement of the young people sent to be brought up in her care. It was demanding, unglamorous, unending work, the quiet machinery of keeping a vast inheritance running smoothly, and it was work that the chronicles, fixed on battles and kings, almost never trouble to record. But it was the real daily substance of a noblewoman's life, and she was, by all the signs, good at it. The same intelligence and steadiness that would carry her through her later sufferings served her here in the long years before the storm, in the patient stewardship of one of the largest fortunes in the land. And picture, too, the physical world in which all this life was lived, for it was unlike anything in our own experience, and she moved through it every day. Her great houses were not the comfortable places we might imagine, but vast, draughty, stone-built strongholds, beautiful in their way and bitterly cold in their reality, lit by candle and rushlight and the leap of broad fires that never quite drove the chill from the thick-walled chambers. The halls would have been hung with rich tapestries, partly for splendour and partly to keep out the cold. The floors strewn with rushes and herbs, the windows small, and in the better rooms, glazed against the weather. Life was lived to the rhythm of the bells and the daylight, rising early, retiring early, the long dark evenings filled with what light and warmth could be mustered. There would have been the constant presence of people, for a great lady was never alone, attendants everywhere, her people always about her, privacy in our sense almost unknown. There would have been the smells of wood smoke and tallow and cooking and the press of many bodies, the sounds of the establishment at its work, the kitchens and the stables and the chapel, the seasonal round of feast and fast that ordered the year. In winter the cold would have been a constant companion. In summer the household might move from one residence to another, partly to allow the vacated house to be cleaned. It was a hard, communal, ceremonious way of living, rich and uncomfortable at once, and she knew it in all its seasons across her long life. From the splendour of her years as a ruling countess to the diminished dependence of her widowhood. The grandeur we associate with such a life was real, but it was a grandeur of cold stone and guttering flame and endless company, very far from ease. And it formed the daily texture of Anne's world from her cradle at Caversham to her last years in the shelter of an abbey. It is worth understanding the peculiar position of a wealthy heiress in Anne's world, for it was a position of immense value and almost no power, and the contradiction lay at the very heart of her life. A woman like Anne was, in one sense, among the most important people in the kingdom. She carried in her person a fortune that could make a powerful man greater, that kings and dukes would scheme to control, that could tip the balance of power in the realm. And yet that very value rendered her, in another sense, helpless, for it meant that she was perpetually an object of other people's designs, a prize to be won and held and fought over, rather than an agent acting on her own behalf. Her wealth was hers and not hers. She held the lands, but her husband administered them and drew the power from them. Her hand was the most valuable in England, but it had been given away when she was a child by others for reasons of their own. Everything that made her precious also made her a kind of possession, the carrier of a fortune that men would use as they saw fit. This was the common lot of heiresses, and most of them lived out their lives within it without protest, for it was simply how the world was ordered. But it gives a particular poignancy to Anne's story, for the great inheritance that defined her was both the source of all her consequence and the instrument of all her suffering. Had she been a poorer woman, a lesser heiress, no one would have schemed to control her. No king would have coveted her lands. No act of parliament would have been contrived to declare her dead. It was precisely her wealth that drew the storm down upon her. The fortune that made her one of the greatest ladies in England was also, in the end, the thing that destroyed her peace. And she could neither fully command it nor ever be free of it. She was its keeper and its prisoner at once. There is a phrase that the lawyers used of Anne's position, and it is worth turning over, for it captures both her distinction and her powerlessness in a single breath. She was Countess of Warwick suo jure, the Latin meaning in her own right, holding the title and the lands by her own blood, and not as any husband's gift. It was a rare and significant thing, to be a peeress in her own person rather than merely the wife of a peer, and it marked her out as a person of genuine standing, the true holder of one of the great earldoms of England. The title was hers, the blood was hers, the inheritance flowed through her, and not through her husband, who held his own earldom only by virtue of marrying her. And yet, for all the dignity of that phrase, how little she was actually permitted to do with it. The title was hers, but her husband wielded the power that came with it. She owned the lands, but her husband drew the revenues and commanded the followings. When the storm came, she could not defend her own inheritance. It was seized in the names of others, divided by her sons-in-law, legislated away by a parliament that ruled her dead. The phrase promised everything, and the reality delivered almost nothing, for a woman's claim, however genuine in law, counted for little against the will of the men who surrounded her. There is the whole tragedy of her position in that gap between the phrase and the fact, between the countess who owned the title by her own blood and the powerless widow robbed of all she owned. To be a great lady so owed, in that world, was to hold a title that everyone acknowledged and a power that no one would let her use, and she possessed exactly that, the empty dignity of a claim she was never permitted to press. The countess of an earldom she could not defend, the owner of lands taken from her while the law still called her their rightful lady. The life of Anne and her family was lived between two great houses, and one of them would prove the stage for something quietly momentous. The family divided its time between the southern seat in the green Midland country and a northern stronghold among the high moors and dales of Yorkshire, and in both Anne presided as lady of the house. It was in that northern home in particular that the momentous thing occurred, for in those days the sons of the nobility were commonly sent to grow up in the houses of other great families, and by that custom a boy of the royal blood was placed for a time in Anne's northern home. His name was Richard, the youngest brother of the king, and one day he would be king himself, and the husband of Anne's own younger daughter. But that lay far ahead, for now he was simply a boy being raised in her house, learning the use of arms and the ways of a noble house at Middleham, alongside Anne's two daughters, beneath the one roof, in the years before fortune threw them all together and then tore them apart. There is a deeper resonance in those two houses than mere geography, for they stood for the two halves of Anne's own identity, the two bloodlines that met in her children. Warwick Castle was Beauchamp, was hers, the seat of her own ancestors, the place where her family's greatness was rooted and remembered. To be there was to be among her own people and her own past. Surrounded by the tombs and the badges and the long memory of the Beauchamps from whom her whole inheritance flowed, Middleham, by contrast, was Neville, was her husband's, a stronghold of the family she had married into, rather than the family she had been born to, set in the harder northern country that bred a harder kind of lord. Between these two poles, the gentler Beauchamp south and the rugged Neville north, Anne's life and her children's upbringing were divided, and in that division was something of the truth of her whole situation. She was a Beauchamp heiress who had become a Neville wife. The bridge between two great houses, the point at which the old Beauchamp greatness was poured into the rising Neville ambition. Her daughters were the fruit of that joining, Beauchamp and Neville blood combined, heiresses of the one and members of the other. And the two houses themselves embodied the strange doubleness of Anne's position, that her own inheritance, her Beauchamp birthright, had become the foundation of Neville power, that what was hers by blood had become her husband's by marriage, that she was at once the source of the family's greatness, and in the eyes of the law and the age, merely the wife who had brought it. She moved between Warwick and Middleham as she moved between those two truths, an heiress in her own right, and the wife of a great lord, the two never quite the same thing, and the gap between them, the space in which her whole later tragedy would unfold. For Anne was by this time a mother, and her two daughters would become the chief instruments and the chief victims of the family's towering ambition. Her first child, a daughter named Isabel, was born in the year 1451, when she was 24. Her second daughter, Anne, named for her mother, came some 5 years later. There were no surviving sons. The two girls were the only children, and as such they were heirs of staggering value, the carriers of the whole vast fortune into whatever families they might one day marry. Anne raised them as great heiresses were raised, teaching them all that a lady of their standing was meant to master, readying them for the dazzling matches their birth and their wealth were certain to bring. She would have taught them, or seen them taught, to read and to manage a household, to carry themselves with grace, to understand the duties and the dangers of their station, and she would have known, as every mother of heiresses knew, that her daughters' marriages would not be theirs to choose, that they would be given where the interests of the family directed, that they were, in the cold arithmetic of their world, the most precious cards their father held. Whether Anne grieved over that knowledge, whether she wished a gentler fate for her girls than the one their value would bring them, we cannot know, for she left no record of her heart. But she was a mother, and she would live to see both her daughters married to the brothers of kings, and to see both of them dead before her, worn out and used up by the ambitions into which they had been born. Of all the sorrows Anne Beauchamp would endure, and they were many, the loss of her daughters would surely be the deepest. There is a particular anguish reserved for the mothers of rich heiresses, and she would drink it to the dregs. To raise a daughter in such a house was to raise her in the knowledge that she was, however beloved, also a piece of property, a card to be played, a means to an end that others would determine. A mother might love her girls fiercely and tend them with all the care in the world, and yet she knew from their birth that they did not belong to themselves, that their marriages would be arranged for the advantage of the line, that they might be sent far away to households not their own, wed to men they had never met, used as the seals on alliances and the instruments of ambition. Anne raised her two daughters to be exactly the great heiresses they were, and in doing so she prepared them for fates she could not control and might well have feared. She would have known, watching them grow, that their very value made them vulnerable, that the wealth and the blood that made them such desirable brides also made them pawns in games far larger than themselves. And in the end her daughters' fates would justify every fear a loving mother could have harboured. And in the end her daughters' fates would justify every fear a loving mother could have held. Both would go to their graves before their mother, the brilliant marriages she had prepared for them, leading each, by her own long and bitter road, to an early death. There is no crueler vindication of a parent's dread than to watch it all come true, and that vindication was the one her life delivered, in full, set the two daughters side by side. And their parallel fates form a kind of mournful symmetry that must have weighed on their mother more heavily than any single loss. The elder, married to a royal duke in defiance of a king, bore her first child to death upon a storm-tossed sea, survived to bear others, and died worn out before she was 30. The younger wagered first to a Lancastrian prince, and then wed to a Yorkist duke, climbed all the way to the throne, became a queen, lost her only child, and died young and grieving with the crown barely warm upon her head. Two daughters, two glittering marriages, two early graves. Both girls had been raised by the same mother for the same brilliant destiny. Both had been used as instruments of their father's ambition. Both had been carried by that ambition to dazzling heights. And both had been destroyed by the lives those heights demanded of them. Neither lived to see 35, neither died in peace. And their mother outlived them both. The woman who had borne them and raised them and prepared them for greatness, left to bury first the one and then the other, the elder and then the younger, until both the lives she had brought into the world were gone and she alone remained. There is no arranging of words that can soften what that must have been, to raise two daughters and bury them both. To see the brilliant futures one had prepared for them lead each, by her own road, into an early grave. The currency of the family's ambition was paid in full in the lives of those two girls, and their mother lived to count the whole bitter sum, the elder dead at 25, the younger a dead queen, and herself, the survivor of them both, grieving in her diminished old age for the daughters she had raised for glory and lost to it. Of all the losses that Anne Beauchamp endured, and they were many, surely none cut deeper than this double burial of her children, the two daughters of her body gone before her into the dark. Anne's whole life, looked at from a certain angle, is a study in the powerlessness of women in her age, even women of the very highest rank, and it is worth drawing that lesson out plainly. For it is one of the truest things her story has to teach. Consider how little of her own life she was ever permitted to direct. She did not choose her husband. He was chosen for her when she was a child. She did not choose to become a countess. The title fell to her through the deaths of others. She did not choose her daughters' marriages. Her husband made them for his own ends. She did not choose her family's revolts, her flight into exile, her years in sanctuary, her dispossession, or any of the great turns that shaped her fate. At every juncture, the decisions that governed her life were made by men, her father, her husband, her sons-in-law, the kings who ruled her world, and she could only live out the consequences of choices she had no part in making. Even her wealth, which might seem to have given her power, was administered by her husband and seized by her sons-in-law. She held the greatest fortune in England and could not prevent it being taken from her. This was the condition of women in her world, even the greatest of them, to be valued and used, prized and disposed of, their persons and their fortunes, the instruments of men's designs, their own wills scarcely consulted. Anne is a particularly stark example because she was so great a prize and suffered so complete a dispossession, but her powerlessness was only an extreme case of the common female lot. And yet, within that powerlessness, she found the one thing that was truly her own, the strength to endure, to outlast, to refuse to be destroyed by what was done to her. She could not command her fate, but she could survive it, and in the end, her survival was its own quiet form of power, the only kind her world left open to a woman. But a real one for all that. They could take her lands and her status, and even her legal existence. They could not take her endurance, and it was endurance, in the end, that she made her own. And yet it would be wrong to leave the impression that she was merely passive, a thing acted upon and nothing more. For within the narrow space her world allowed her, she showed, again and again, a quiet strength of her own. She managed great estates with skill through years of turmoil. She held her household together through rebellion and exile and disaster. She endured sanctuary and dispossession without breaking. And at the very end, old and robbed and alone, she did not simply accept her erasure, but gathered herself and pressed her claim against a king, insisting upon her own existence. Wringing from the new Tudor monarch at least an acknowledgement that she lived. These were not the acts of a passive victim, they were the acts of a woman of real resolution, working within the cruel limits of her world to preserve what she could and to assert what was hers. The powerlessness was real, and it should not be minimized. She could not choose her marriages or her wars or prevent the theft of her lands. But within that powerlessness, she was not nothing. She was a capable manager, a faithful keeper of her family's interests, a survivor of extraordinary resilience, and at the last, a petitioner who would not let herself be written out of existence without a fight. There is a measure of agency even in endurance, even in survival, even in the stubborn refusal to be destroyed, and she possessed it in full. She could not command the great events of her age. No woman could. But she could meet them with courage and intelligence and an unbreakable will to go on, and she did. Through more than 60 years of some of the hardest history her country ever knew, that is not passivity. It is a quieter and a tougher sort of strength, the strength of the one who bends but does not break, who is battered by every storm and yet remains standing when the storms have passed. And it is that strength, more than her birth or her wealth or her famous husband, that makes Anne Beauchamp worth remembering. Perhaps the truest way to think of her, in the end, is as a kind of monument to endurance, a living proof of how much a human being can bear and still remain whole. We build monuments of stone to those who win great victories, who conquer and command and shape the world by force of will. We build few to those who simply endure, who are battered by every wave and yet are not destroyed, who lose everything and go on living, who survive. What would have shattered most and keep, through it all, their essential selves intact. Yet, endurance of that sort is its own achievement, harder in its way than any conquest, and she was its living embodiment. She lost her father, her brother, her niece, her grandchild, her husband, both her daughters, her son-in-law, her lands, her status, her very legal existence, and the whole world she had been born into, and through all of it she remained herself, capable, dignified, unbroken, going on. That is a kind of monument, built not of stone, but of sheer persistence, a testament to the strength that endures when everything else is stripped away. When we remember her, we should remember her not with pity, though her sufferings were great, but with a kind of admiration for the quiet, unbreakable strength that carried her through a life that would have destroyed almost anyone. She was not a conqueror or a queen. She made no mark upon the events of her age by any act of will. But she endured them, all of them, the rises and the falls, the triumphs and the catastrophes, and she came through to the end, still standing, still herself, still unbowed. And there is a greatness in that, a quiet and unsung greatness, the greatness of the survivor, which deserves to be honoured as fully as the louder kind belonging to those who fought and fell. She endured. It is a simple thing to say, and the hardest thing in the world to do, across a life as long and as cruel as hers. That she did it, and did it with dignity, and came through unbroken to a peaceful grave, is her true monument, more lasting than any of stone. And it is that, above all, that makes her worth remembering. While she kept her houses and raised her daughters, her husband was becoming the most powerful subject England had ever seen. Using the immense wealth and the great network of lordships that had come to him through Anne, he made himself the indispensable man of the realm, the broker of crowns, the lord whose support could raise a king or cast him down. He played a decisive part in setting one king upon the throne, and the world began to call him by the name that history has kept for him ever since. The Kingmaker. He was the richest and the mightiest nobleman in the land. His retainers numbered in the thousands, his badge known and feared the length of England, and at the foundation of all of it stood Anne and her inheritance, the wealth that fed his armies and the lands that gave him his power. She was the wife of the greatest man in the kingdom, and she shared his splendour. The vast households, the lavish hospitality for which he was famous, the deference of all who came near. Yet it is worth pausing on what it must have meant to be that man's wife. His ambition was boundless, and it reached, in the end, toward the throne itself. Not for himself, but for those he could control. To stand beside such a husband was to stand near the very centre of the kingdom's power, and also near the very centre of its danger. For a man who made kings could also make enemies of kings, and the higher he climbed, the further there was to fall. She, one imagines, understood this better than most. She had brought him the means of his greatness, and she would share, in time, the full and terrible price of it. There is a quiet irony in the fact that the man remembered as the maker of kings owed his power at the root to a woman whom history has very nearly forgotten. Strip away the famous title and the legend, and the foundation of the Kingmaker's greatness was simple. He was rich beyond almost any other man in England, and he was rich because he had married Anne. The lands were hers, the inheritance was hers. The blood that had drawn the whole fortune together into one pair of hands was hers. He held it all juraxoris by right of his wife, and from it he drew the revenues that paid his armies, the lordships that gave him his followings, the standing that made him the indispensable broker of the realm. Without Anne's inheritance, he would have been merely another well-born younger son. With it, he was the Colossus, who could raise kings and cast them down. And yet the legend records him alone. He is the Kingmaker. She is a footnote, the wife, the means by which the lands came to him. There is a deep unfairness in that, and it tells us something about how the age regarded women even of the highest rank, that a woman might be the very source of a man's greatness and still be written out of the story of it. Her contribution folded silently into his glory. Anne knew surely what she had brought to her husband. She knew that the power he wielded rested on her own birthright, that the armies and the followings and the famous badge all stood, ultimately, on the foundation of her inheritance. Whether she took pride in it, or resented being so wholly subsumed into his glory, or simply accepted it as the way of her world, we cannot say. But it is worth saying plainly, since the chronicles will not the Kingmaker was made, in large part, by his wife, and the power that shook England was, at its source, Anne Beauchamp's own. It is worth conjuring, too, the sheer public magnificence of the family at its height, for she lived at the centre of a splendour that few in England could match. Her husband was famous for the scale of his hospitality, keeping open house on a princely scale, feeding multitudes at his tables, moving through the land with great trains of retainers, all wearing his badge and his colours. To be his wife was to preside over this magnificence, to be the lady of households that rivalled the king's own, to dispense a hospitality that was itself a form of power, binding men to the family by the bonds of food and favour and display. The badge her husband's men wore was known and feared the length of the kingdom. His livery was a sign of might, and Anne stood at the heart of it all, the mistress of the establishments from which this greatness was projected. There is a particular poignancy in setting this splendour beside what came after. The woman who had presided over princely households, who had dispensed hospitality on a scale to rival the crown, who had been the lady of one of the richest establishments in the land, would end her days a dependent pensioner in another's house, then a suppliant in an abbey, stripped of all that magnificence, reduced to pleading for a fraction of what had once been hers. The contrast measures the whole distance of her fall. She had known the very heights of worldly splendour, the open tables and the liveried multitudes and the deference of a kingdom, and she had known the very depths of dispossession, the abbey cell and the cold charity of others, and the legal erasure of her own existence. Few lives span so wide a gulf between their greatest and their least, and Anne lived through the whole of that descent. From the lady of princely halls to the forgotten old woman of Beauchamp, losing by degrees everything that splendour had given her, until nothing remained but the bare and stubborn fact of her survival. For the England of Anne's middle years was sliding into catastrophe, the long and bloody struggle that would come to be called the Wars of the Roses, in which the great families of the land tore at one another for control of the crown. It is hard, from the comfort of our own age, to feel the full horror of living through such a time, but Anne lived through the whole of it, and it shaped and finally shattered her life. For a generation, the kingdom was racked by rebellion and battle, by sudden reversals of fortune, in which the great man of one year was the corpse or the fugitive of the next. Kings were captured and freed, and captured again. Crowned and uncrowned and murdered, the heads of noble houses fell in battle or under the axe. Families were divided against themselves, and no one who stood near the heights of power could feel safe for long. For a woman of Anne's rank, the wars meant a particular kind of suffering. The endless waiting for news, the dread of every messenger, the knowledge that the men of her family rode out time after time into deadly peril, and that her own security, her wealth, her very freedom, hung upon the swing of battles she could not influence, and often could not even witness. She did not fight. Women did not. But she endured, which in its way was harder, watching from her castles as the storm gathered and broke and gathered again, and as the men around her staked everything, over and over, on the turn of the wheel. The wars would take from Anne, before they were done, almost everything she had, and she could only wait and watch and survive. It is worth setting Anne's private tragedy against the public catastrophe that produced it. For she was caught up in one of the mightiest convulsions of English history, and her sufferings were, in a sense, the wars written small in the life of a single woman. The long conflict between the two branches of the royal house tore the kingdom for the better part of 3 decades, and it was a peculiarly terrible kind of war, a war of the nobility against itself, in which the families that should have been the pillars of the realm instead destroyed one another in a generation of bloodshed. It was no war of foreign invasion or peasant rising. It was a war within the ruling class itself, brother against brother, cousin against cousin, the same handful of proud houses tearing themselves apart in pursuit of the crown. And because it was a war among the nobility, it fell with particular weight on the noble families, on the very people who in quieter times stood safest. The lords rode out to their battles and were killed or executed. Their wives and daughters and mothers waited at home and absorbed the losses. Whole dynasties were cut down in a few savage years. Her family was at the very heart of it, her husband, one of its chief actors, and so her family suffered the conflict's violence in concentrated form, every reversal of the great struggle registering as a blow in her own life. The deaths, the rebellions, the flights into exile, the seizures of property, the executions, all the machinery of that bloodletting passed directly through her family and her life, until the fighting had taken from her very nearly everything she had. Her story is in miniature the story of what that conflict did to the English nobility, the dizzying rises and the catastrophic falls, the fortunes made and lost in a season, the families exalted and then destroyed, the women left to grieve and endure while the men killed one another for a crown. To understand Anne's life is to understand the human cost of that civil war, paid out in the currency of individual grief, in the bodies of husbands and sons and daughters, in the dispossession of widows and the erasure of heiresses. She was one of the great war's countless casualties, not killed by it, but hollowed out by it, robbed by it of her family and her fortune and her peace and her survival of it, battered but unbroken, is one of the quieter triumphs to be found in all that catalogue of disaster. There is a particular quality to the suffering of the women in those wars that deserves to be dwelt upon. For it was a suffering of waiting rather than of action, and waiting can be the harder thing to bear. The men rode out to their battles, and whatever the terror of the field, they at least were doing something, gripping a sword, moving toward their fate with their own hands. The women stayed behind in the castles and the manor houses, and could only wait for news, and the waiting was its own kind of torment. Imagine the days and weeks of not knowing, the husband or the son or the brother gone off to a battle whose outcome would not be known for days. The messengers watched for, with a dread that curdled in the stomach, every distant rider a possible bearer of catastrophe. And when the news came, it might be anything, victory or ruin, safety or death, the familiar world preserved or shattered in an instant by a few words from a tired man on a blown horse. She lived through years of this, through reversal after reversal, never able to act, only to wait and to dread and to absorb whatever blow the latest battle had dealt. She could not fight. She could not influence the great events that would determine her fate. She could only endure them as they came, and find what strength she could to carry on through each new turn of the wheel. It is a kind of courage that the chronicles rarely celebrate, the courage of endurance, of holding a household and a family together through years of mortal uncertainty, of bearing the unbearable suspense of a world in which everything one loved might be destroyed at any moment by forces entirely beyond one's reach. But it was the courage Anne's whole life would demand of her, and she had it in full measure. She was, above all else, one who endured, and the long waiting of the war years was the school in which that endurance was forged. The first great crisis of the family's fortunes came through Anne's elder daughter, Isabel, and the marriage that drew the whole household into open rebellion. Anne's husband, for all his power, had grown bitterly estranged from the king he had helped to crown, and in his anger he turned to a dangerous design. He would marry his elder daughter Isabel to the king's own brother, a young man named George, Duke of Clarence, and so bind a prince of the blood to his own cause. The king forbade the match, but Anne's husband defied him, and the wedding went ahead across the sea, in the great fortress that her husband commanded on the French coast, beyond the reach of the king's prohibition. So Isabel, Anne's firstborn, the girl she had raised and schooled, was married to a royal duke in a ceremony that was itself an act of defiance, the opening move in her father's revolt against the crown. For her, the marriage must have been a thing of mixed feeling indeed. Pride, perhaps, that her daughter had wed a king's brother, and dread at the open breach with the king that the match announced. Whatever she felt, events now moved beyond anyone's controlling. Her husband's revolt flared into open war. For a time he held the king himself a prisoner and tried to rule through him. Then the wheel turned, the rising collapsed, and Anne's husband, with his new son-in-law and his whole family, was suddenly a hunted traitor, forced to flee the kingdom for his life. The countess who had presided over the greatest fortune in England found herself, almost overnight, a fugitive, gathering her daughters and what she could carry and fleeing toward the sea. It is worth pausing to feel the shift that this great breach marked in Anne's life, for it was the moment her world began to come apart. And she would have sensed it even if she could not have named it. For all the dangers of the wars, the family had until now ridden the storm successfully. Her husband had backed the winning side, and his fortunes and hers had risen with it. But in turning against the king he had made, her husband was stepping off the solid ground of victory and onto the treacherous footing of revolt, gambling everything he and Anne possessed on a desperate throw. From the safety of her castles, she would have watched this happen with a mounting dread that no comfort could ease. She had brought her husband the wealth that made his power. Now she would share the peril as he staked that power against the crown, and there was a particular bitterness in the form the rebellion took. for it was built upon the marriage of her own daughter. Isabel was not merely wed to a royal duke, she was made the instrument of her father's treason. Her marriage the means by which a prince of the blood was bound into the revolt. Anne's child had become a piece in the most dangerous game her father had ever played. Whatever pride she might have taken in seeing her daughter wed so high was poisoned by the knowledge of what that marriage really was and what it might cost them all. The family was committed now to a course from which there could be no easy turning back. And she, who had no voice in the decision, could only follow where her husband led, gathering her household and her daughters and bracing herself for whatever the gamble would bring. It brought, in the end, in a kind of catastrophe. But the first step onto that road was the rebellion built on Isabel's marriage, and from that step there was no returning to the safe ground they had left. The flight across the water was a nightmare that she would surely remember to the end of her days, for it cost the family a life before they even reached safety. Isabel, the elder daughter, was heavily pregnant as they fled, near her time, and the family took ship in desperate haste to escape the king's vengeance. But the sea gave them no mercy. A fierce storm caught the ships and drove them helpless upon the waves, unable to make the safe harbour they sought, denied even entry to the port that her husband had once commanded. And it was in the midst of that storm, with the worst possible timing, that Isabel was brought to bed of her child. What happened there upon the water was a sorrow that fell hardest on the women, and it is a scene worth dwelling on. For the histories pass over it too lightly. It was a cruel beginning to the family's exile, a death before the danger had even fully fallen upon them. The men had made the rebellion, but it was the women who paid its first installment, and they paid it at sea. Let us stay a moment with that terrible passage, for it deserves more than a hurried telling, and it shows us something essential about the kind of suffering that fell to the women of this story. The men's disasters were public and recorded: the lost battle, the failed rebellion, the flight into exile. But here, aboard a labouring ship in a storm, was a disaster that belonged entirely to the women, unwitnessed by the chroniclers, suffered in the dark and the wet and the heaving of the sea. Picture the scene as Anne must have lived it. Her elder daughter, young and heavily pregnant, going into labour at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible place, with the ship pitching beneath them and the storm howling outside, and no midwife, no quiet chamber, no proper care of any kind. Nothing but the cramped and reeling hold of a vessel fleeing for all their lives. And Anne herself, the mother, able to do so little, watching her daughter labour in terror and pain, helping where she could, with whatever poor means were at hand, praying perhaps for a mercy that did not come, for the child did not live. Born into that chaos, with none of the help that even a poor woman on dry land might have had, the baby died, and there was not even the comfort of a proper burial, only the grey and pitiless sea. It is the kind of grief that leaves no monument, that the histories pass over in a line, if they note it at all, and yet for the women who endured it, it must have been among the sharpest sorrows of their lives. She had now seen her first grandchild born and lost in a single dreadful night upon the water, and she had not even reached the shore of her exile yet. The rebellion her husband had made was being paid for, as so often, in the bodies of the women, and the first instalment had been collected in the dark, at sea, where no chronicler could see, spare a thought to. For what the exile itself must have been, once the family had struggled ashore at last, for it was a hard and humiliating interval in lives that had known nothing but eminence. To flee one's own country as a hunted traitor, to throw oneself on the mercy or the calculation of a foreign court, to live as a suppliant and a dependent in a strange land, waiting on the favour of others for the chance to return, was a bitter reversal for those who had stood at the very summit of England. They had been among the mightiest people in their own kingdom. Now they were exiles and petitioners abroad, their fortunes wholly dependent on the schemes and the goodwill of a foreign power. For her, the exile would have meant uncertainty, heaped upon grief, the loss of her familiar houses and her settled life, the strain of living in a strange country among strangers, all the while not knowing whether they would ever recover their place or end its days in penniless obscurity overseas. It was during this exile that the desperate Lancastrian alliance was forged, the marriage of her younger daughter to the enemy prince, for only by such desperate measures that an exiled and broken family could hope to claw its way back to power. So the exile was not merely a time of waiting, it was a time of dangerous bargains struck from weakness, of the family staking everything on increasingly desperate throws, because the alternative was permanent ruin. She lived through all of it, the flight, the loss at sea, the strange foreign refuge, the frightening new alliance, the gathering for one last gamble, and she did so as she did everything, without power to shape events, able only to endure them, and to follow where her husband's desperation led. The exile was one more station on her long road of suffering, and like all the others, she survived it, only to be carried by it toward the catastrophe that waited for her across the water, on a field in the fog at Barnet. In exile and desperate, Anne's husband now made the most startling reversal of his whole turbulent career, and it required the sacrifice of his second daughter. Having broken with the Yorkist king he had made, he turned, astonishingly, to the very enemies he had spent his life fighting, the House of Lancaster, and to the formidable exiled queen, who was its champion. To seal this almost unthinkable new alliance, a price was demanded, and the price was Anne's younger daughter. The girl, barely into her teens, was betrothed to the son and heir of the Lancastrian king, and the prince who was the great hope of the cause her father had so long opposed. But she had no power to prevent it. The marriage was made, the alliance was sealed, and the family prepared to return to England and stake everything once more. This time under the banner they had spent a generation fighting against. Consider what this reversal asked of Anne as a mother, for it was perhaps the most painful of all the demands her husband's ambition made upon the family. Her two daughters had been raised together, sisters in one household, and now they were to be set on opposite sides of the deadliest quarrel in the land. The elder was already wed to the brother of the Yorkist king. The younger was now to be married to the heir of the Lancastrian one, the very house their family had spent a generation fighting. It was a calculation of pure cynicism, a hedging of bets so cold that it used Anne's own children as the stakes on either side of the board. And the younger daughter's fate was the harder, for she was being handed to the household of the formidable Lancastrian queen, a woman who had every reason in the world to hate the family that had so long opposed her and had killed so many of her friends. To send a young girl into the keeping of such a mother-in-law in such circumstances as the seal on an alliance forged in desperation was to send her among enemies. To a marriage that was wholly a matter of policy, and not in the smallest degree a matter of her own heart or happiness. She could do nothing. She had no more power to protect her younger daughter from this fate than she had had to protect the elder from her rebellion marriage. She could only watch as her second child was bartered away in her turn, married into the camp of the family's old foes, a hostage to fortune in the most literal sense. Both her daughters were now spent, played out as cards in their father's desperate game, wed to the rival claimants of a divided crown. Whatever happened next, she had already lost something no victory could restore: the ordinary hope of a mother that her children might be safe and settled and happy. That hope had been sacrificed to the family's ambition, and it would never be returned to her. For a brief and giddy moment, it seemed the great gamble might pay off. Anne's husband led an invasion back into England, and the Yorkist king, caught unprepared, was forced to flee the kingdom in his turn. The Lancastrian king was pulled from his prison in the Tower and set back upon the throne, and for a few short months the world was turned upside down. The house her husband now served was restored. The king he had once made was a fugitive overseas, and Anne's family stood, once again, at the very summit of power. This brief restoration, this strange second reign of the old Lancastrian king, was the high-water mark of the family's fortunes under their new colours. Anne's husband was once more the greatest man in the kingdom, the architect of a king's restoration, and his daughters were positioned between them, to be connected to whichever side finally prevailed. Anne herself prepared to cross back to England to rejoin her triumphant husband. But the triumph was an illusion, as hollow as it was brief. The deposed Yorkist king did not stay away. He gathered his strength abroad, and within months he returned, landing in England, to reclaim the crown he had lost, and the whole fragile structure of her husband's restoration began, almost at once, to crack. Anne's crossing back to her homeland, which should have been a return in triumph, would instead carry her straight into the worst catastrophe of her life. For even as she sailed, the armies were gathering, and the battle that would destroy her family forever was only days away. There is a cruel symmetry in the timing of what followed, and Anne stood at the very hinge of it. For a few short months the world hung in a balance so fine that her family could not lose. With one daughter married to the Yorkist side and the other to the Lancastrian, whichever way the final reckoning fell, she would be the mother of a daughter on the winning side. It was, in its cold way, a masterstroke, a guarantee against every outcome. And yet it guaranteed her nothing that mattered, for whichever daughter won, the other would lose, and Anne loved them both. There was no outcome in which she could simply be happy. There was only the certainty that triumph for one of her children meant disaster for the other, and that she would be both the mother of a victor and the mother of the vanquished, no matter how the wheel came to rest. So even at the high water mark of their fortunes, even in the brief glory of the restoration her husband had engineered, she could take no untroubled joy. She prepared to cross back to England to rejoin her triumphant husband, but she crossed toward a reckoning whose every possible shape held grief for her, and the reckoning, when it came, would be worse than any she could have feared, for it would not give her one winning daughter and one losing one. It would, in the space of a few terrible weeks, take her husband, shatter both her daughter's prospects at a single stroke, and leave her not the mother of a victor at all, but a widow with nothing. Fleeing for sanctuary, the clever hedging of bets that had seemed to secure the family against every outcome secured it, in the end, against none. It is worth dwelling on the strange world that the brief restoration created, for it was a topsy-turvy interval in which all the certainties of Anne's life were inverted. Those who had risen as the makers of the Yorkist king were now the props of the restored Lancastrian one. The cause they had fought against for a generation was suddenly their own. The king they had made was a fugitive overseas, and the king they had spent their lives opposing sat once more, feebly, upon the throne. For her, returning to this transformed England would have been a deeply disorienting thing, a homecoming to a country where everything familiar had been turned on its head. Her younger daughter was now bound to the Lancastrian heir. Her whole family's future was staked on the survival of a restoration that had been achieved by the most desperate of means and rested on the most fragile of foundations. There can have been little real security in it, little untroubled triumph. Even at the moment of their apparent victory, a thoughtful woman would have sensed how precarious it all was, how much depended on the deposed Yorkist king staying away, how easily the whole improvised structure might collapse if fortune turned again. And turn it did, with terrible speed. The restoration that had seemed, for a few short months, to crown the family's gamble with success, proved to be a brief illusion, a false dawn before the darkest night of all. Anne had crossed the sea toward what looked like triumph, and she crossed toward catastrophe, and the topsy-turvy world of the Restoration, in which her family briefly held everything, was about to collapse into the ruin in which they would lose it all. She had lived in those few strange months at the very peak of her family's fortunes under their new colours. She would descend from that peak within weeks. All the way to the bottom, the blow fell on a fog-shrouded morning in the spring of 1471 on a field north of London near a town called Barnet. There, in the grey murk of an Easter dawn, the army of Anne's husband met the army of the returning Yorkist king, and in the confusion of the mist, with the lines of battle wheeling and colliding in the half-light, the Kingmaker's host was broken, and Anne's husband, the greatest subject in England, the man whose power had rested on her inheritance, was killed, cut down in the rout, stripped and dead upon the field. The Maker of Kings was unmade at last. His long career of triumph and reversal ended in the fog at Barnet. Anne, by the most terrible of timings, had only just landed in England when the news reached her. She had crossed the sea, expecting to rejoin a triumphant husband at the height of his restored power. Instead, she stepped ashore into a kingdom where, on the very day of her landing or near it, that husband had been killed and his cause shattered. In a single stroke, she was transformed from the wife of the mightiest man in the realm into the widow of a defeated traitor, her protector dead, her family's power in ruins. The victorious king certain to seek vengeance on all who had stood against him. Everything that had defined her life, the great marriage, the vast power, the towering position, was swept away in the fog of one morning. And worse was still to come. For within weeks, the Lancastrian cause to which her younger daughter had been wed would be annihilated in another battle. The young prince her daughter had married killed. The old king murdered soon after. The whole edifice came crashing down at once, and Anne stood amid the wreckage, a widow with no protector and everything to fear. There is a detail of timing here, so cruel that it almost beggars belief, and it is worth holding it up to the light. She had spent her months of exile waiting and dreading across the sea, and at last the moment came to return, to cross back to England and rejoin her husband at the height of his restored power. She set sail toward what should have been a homecoming in triumph, the wife of the man who had just remade a king, returning to share in his glory. And she landed in England on the very day, or within a day, that her husband was killed. Think of what that means. As her ship was making the crossing, as she stood perhaps on the deck, watching the English coast draw near, full of whatever hopes and fears the moment held, the battle was being fought that would destroy everything, and her husband was dying in the fog. She came ashore not into triumph, but into the wreckage of a world that had ended while she was still at sea, ignorant, hopeful, on her way home. The news must have reached her almost as she set foot on land. Not welcome, not reunion, but the worst tidings of her life, delivered at the very threshold of the homecoming she had crossed the sea to enjoy. In a single day, she passed from being the wife of the mightiest man in England, sailing home to his side, to being the widow of a defeated traitor, alone in a hostile country, with her protector dead and the victors certain to come for what was hers. Few reversals in all of history are so sharp or so cruelly timed. She had carried her hopes across the water only to have them shattered at the moment of arrival. And the shore she had longed to reach proved to be the edge of the abyss into which her whole life now fell. There was only one thing a defenceless widow of the losing side could do, and she did it. She fled into sanctuary. She made her way to Beaulieu Abbey, a large religious house in the south, and there she claimed the protection of the church. The woman who had been mistress of the greatest fortune in England, who had presided over castles and commanded the deference of thousands, was reduced to a frightened widow sheltering in an abbey, stripped of her power, her husband dead, her lands already being eyed by the victors, her daughters scattered and in danger. From the heights of the kingdom she had fallen, in a matter of weeks, to this. And here, in the strange limbo of Beaulieu, she would learn the cruelest lesson of her life, that the law itself could be turned against her, that she could be robbed not by force, but by the stroke of a pen, and that her own daughters' husbands would be the ones to do it. The institution of sanctuary, on which Anne now threw herself, is worth understanding, for it was at once her salvation and her prison, and the contradiction defined her existence for years. By long-standing custom and the law of the Church, certain holy places offered protection to those who fled to them. A fugitive who reached sanctuary could not lawfully be dragged out by force, for to violate that protection was to commit sacrilege against God and the Church. For someone in Anne's position, a defenceless widow of the defeated side, with no protector and no power and everything to fear from the victors, sanctuary was the one shield available, the single thing that stood between her and whatever the triumphant king might choose to do with her. So she fled to it, and within the walls of the abbey she was safe, in the narrow sense that no one could seize her there. But safety of that kind was a cage as much as a refuge. To remain in sanctuary was to be a voluntary prisoner, walled off from the world, unable to manage her affairs or defend her rights or do anything at all but wait, dependent on the charity of the religious house and the slow turning of events outside. She could not leave without surrendering herself to her enemies. She could not stay without surrendering her liberty and her active life. It was a kind of suspended animation, a living burial, in which the woman who had been mistress of the greatest fortune in England sat helpless in an abbey, while others decided her fate and divided her lands. And it was from within this strange limbo, robbed of everything and able to do nothing, that Anne would have to watch the most monstrous injustice of her life unfold. The law itself turned against her, her very existence legislated away, her inheritance handed to others as though she were already in her grave. Sanctuary kept her alive, but it could not keep her free, and it could not keep her lands, and the years she spent within it were years of helpless, galling endurance. Try to imagine the daily reality of those sanctuary years, for they must have been a peculiar torment of idleness and dread. She was not imprisoned in any harsh sense. She was lodged, presumably, in reasonable comfort within the precincts of the abbey, attended by what few servants remained to her, provided with food and shelter by the religious house. But she was walled off from the active life she had always known, cut off from the management of affairs, from the company of equals, from any power to shape events or defend her interests. The days would have stretched long and empty, filled with prayer perhaps, and waiting, and the slow gnawing of anxiety. And into that enforced stillness came, from time to time, the news of the world outside, and almost every piece of it was bad. She would have learned, in her abbey, of her husband's death and the ruin of his cause. She would have learned of the annihilation of the Lancastrian side to which her younger daughter had been wed, of the death of the young prince that daughter had married, of the murder of the old king. She would have learned, as the months passed, of the act that declared her legally dead, of the division of her inheritance between her sons-in-law, of the steady stripping away of everything that had been hers. Each piece of news would have reached her in her helpless seclusion, and to each she could do nothing but listen and endure, unable to act, unable to prevent, unable even to be present at the events that were destroying her. There is a special cruelty in suffering at a distance like that, in receiving the reports of one's own ruin while sitting powerless behind abbey walls, in being erased from the world by people one cannot even confront. She bore years of this, the long, idle, dreadful waiting, the bad news arriving piece by piece, the slow comprehension that her whole world was being dismantled while she could only sit and watch from her sanctuary. That she emerged from those years with her spirit unbroken, still able, in the end, to press her rights and insist upon her own existence, is perhaps the surest proof of the resilience that all who have studied her have remarked. The sanctuary years would have broken a weaker woman entirely. She endured them as she endured everything, and came out the other side, still herself. Now came the strangest and most monstrous injustice of Anne's whole life, and it is worth understanding exactly what was done to her, for it has few parallels in the history of the age. Anne was alive. She was a countess in her own right. The lands she held were hers by her own blood, hers by every law of inheritance, and she had committed no crime. Yet the victorious king and the men around him wanted those lands, and there was an obstacle. While she lived, the great inheritance was legally hers, and could not simply be handed out to others. The solution they reached was breathtaking in its cynicism. By an act of Parliament, the living Countess of Warwick was to be treated, in law, as though she were already dead. The act declared that her inheritance should pass to her heirs, her 2 daughters and their husbands, exactly as it would have done had she died a natural death, even though she was alive and sheltering in sanctuary, not many miles away. A living woman was legally ruled deceased, her existence simply set aside as an inconvenience, so that her property could be divided among those who coveted it. Think of what that meant for Anne. She was not accused of treason. She was not tried or condemned. Her lands were not seized as the forfeit of any crime. She was simply declared, by the stroke of a pen, to be as good as dead, her rights extinguished, not by her own death, but by a legal fiction invented to rob her. It was a theft dressed in the robes of law, and it was carried out, most bitterly of all, for the benefit of the very men who had married her daughters. The husbands of Isabel and Anne, the 2 royal brothers, were the ones who would divide the spoils of her pretended death between them. Her own sons-in-law, in right of her own daughters, were to inherit her living body's lands as though she had gone to her grave. It is worth lingering on just how extraordinary this device was, for it has the quality of something out of a nightmare rather than out of the ordinary cruelty of politics. Men were attainted and their lands forfeited. Widows were robbed of their dowers. Heiresses were married against their will and their fortunes seized by their husbands. All of this was common enough in that hard age, and dreadful as it was, it followed a kind of logic. But to declare a living, blameless woman legally dead, simply in order to lay hands on her property, was something stranger and more chilling. It did not even bother to accuse her of a crime. It did not pretend she had forfeited her rights by any act of her own. It simply erased her, ruled by statute that she did not exist. That her living body might as well be a corpse for all the law would now regard it. There is something almost philosophically disturbing in it, this assertion that a person's very existence could be set aside by an act of Parliament when that existence proved inconvenient to the powerful. Anne was alive. She breathed. She thought. She grieved. She had rights older than any of the men who now conspired against her, and the law, bent to the will of those who coveted her lands, declared all of that to be as nothing, ruled her dead while she lived, that her property might flow to others as though she had truly died. It was theft, but theft of a peculiarly cold and bureaucratic kind, accomplished not with violence, but with parchment and seals, the machinery of law turned into an instrument of dispossession. And it was aimed at a woman who had done nothing, harmed no one, committed no treason, but had only the misfortune to hold lands that powerful men desired. Of all the wrongs done to Anne Beauchamp in her long life of wrongs, this was surely the strangest and the most monstrous. To be told, by the law of her own land, that she was dead, while she sat alive and helpless in an abbey, listening to the news of her own legal demise. And so the inheritance, the fortune that Anne had carried in her blood and kept through all the years of turmoil, was carved up between her two daughters' husbands while she yet lived. The elder daughter's husband, the Duke of Clarence, and the younger daughter's husband, the king's youngest brother, the Duke of Gloucester, divided the vast estates between them in the right of their wives as the heirs of a mother who was not dead. The two royal dukes quarrelled bitterly over the division, each grasping for the larger share, haggling over the lordships and the castles of a woman who was alive to hear of it. There is something almost beyond cruelty in that picture. The two most powerful young men in the kingdom, married to Anne's own daughters, wrangling over the carcass of her inheritance as though she were already cold in the ground while she sat in sanctuary, robbed and helpless and entirely alive. She was left with nothing, a countess without her county, an heiress robbed of her inheritance, a living woman treated as a corpse for the convenience of princes. It was perhaps the bitterest hour in a life that had already held a great many bitter ones, and for the moment she could do nothing at all but bear it. A painful question hangs over this whole episode, and it concerns Anne's daughters, namely, whether they could have done nothing to protect their own mother. They were, after all, the ones in whose name the inheritance was seized, the wives of the two dukes who divided the spoils. One wonders whether they were complicit in their mother's dispossession, or were as helpless as she was. The honest answer is that they were almost certainly helpless, and the fact tells us something bleak about the position of even the highest women in that world. Isabel and Anne were duchesses, married to the brothers of the king, and yet they had no more real power over their own inheritance than their mother did. The lands were taken and divided by their husbands, in the husband's interest, and a wife in that age had little standing to oppose her husband's will, least of all in a matter of property that the law had handed to him. Whatever the daughters felt about the wrong being done to their mother, and we may hope they felt the shame of it keenly, they were in no position to undo it. The deed was their husband's doing, accomplished through the law for the husband's benefit, and the two women were, in their own way, nearly as powerless as the mother who had been declared dead. It is a grim picture of how that world worked. Three women of the very highest rank, a countess and two duchesses, the mother and her girls, and not one of them able to prevent the men around them from stripping the mother of everything she owned. If there is a single image that captures the helplessness of women in Anne's world, it is this: a countess declared dead, and her two duchess children unable to lift a finger to save her. Anne's confinement in sanctuary did not last forever, though her release, when it came, was less a rescue than a transfer from one form of dependence to another. The husband of her younger child, the Duke of Gloucester, having secured his share of her inheritance, eventually obtained the king's permission to release his mother-in-law from Beaulieu and bring her north to live within his household, the household that was now headed by Anne's own younger daughter. And so, after her time walled up in the abbey, Anne was brought out of sanctuary and carried north again, back to the country of the Nevilles, to Middleham, the northern fortress, where that daughter now reigned as duchess, and where, years before, that daughter's husband had been a boy in Anne's own care. It was at least a kind of refuge. She was with her younger daughter again. She was safe from open violence. She had a roof and a place, however diminished. But it was a bitter homecoming, and the years it opened would bring Anne fresh griefs, one after another, as she began the long ordeal that would prove the cruelest of all her trials. The ordeal of outliving her own children. There is a bitter irony folded into the manner of Anne's release, and it is worth drawing out, for it shows how completely her fortunes had been inverted. She was let out of sanctuary, not because justice had been done, not because her rights had been restored, but because her son-in-law, having taken his share of her stolen lands, found it convenient to have her under his own roof. Her freedom, such as it was, came at the pleasure of one of the very men who had robbed her, and it amounted to an exchange of one kind of dependence for another. In the abbey, she had depended on the charity of the church. Now she would depend on the charity of her daughter's husband, the man who held her lands. She had gone from being the mistress of a great inheritance to being a pensioner in another's house. Her bread and her shelter given at the discretion of those who had taken everything from her. And the house to which she was brought sharpened the irony to a fine point, for it was Middleham, one of the very strongholds where she had once reigned as its great lady. She returned to it not as its mistress, but as a dependent, a guest on sufferance in a hall she had once commanded, living now under the authority of the young man whose own upbringing she had once overseen there. Imagine the strangeness of it for her, to walk again the corridors of a house that had been hers, to sit at a table where she had once presided, and to do so now as a powerless old woman, reliant on the goodwill of others. Her status reduced almost to nothing, her lands held by the very man whose roof now sheltered her. It was a homecoming and a humiliation at once, a return to a familiar place under utterly transformed circumstances. She accepted it because she had no choice. It was shelter and safety and the company of her surviving daughter, and for a woman who had been declared dead and robbed of everything, even a dependent's place in a house that had once been her own was better than the cold limbo of sanctuary. But it was a measure of how far she had fallen, and she cannot have walked those familiar halls without feeling, at every turn, the ghost of the great lady she had once been. The figure of her younger son-in-law looms strangely over the last decades of Anne's life, for he was at once the boy she had helped to raise, the man who profited from her dispossession, and the protector who sheltered her in her reduced old age. He had come to Middleham as a child, one of the young people sent to grow up in a great household, and Anne, as the lady of that house, would have known him in his boyhood, overseen in part his upbringing, watched him train and grow among her own daughters. Then the wheel turned, and the boy became a duke, and the duke married Anne's younger daughter, and took his share of Anne's stolen inheritance, and held her lands in right of his wife, while she sat robbed in sanctuary. And then the wheel turned again, and the same man obtained her release, and took her into his household, so that the boy she had once helped to raise became, in the end, the master on whose charity her old age depended. It is a tangled relationship, hard to read across the silence of the records. She may have resented him as one of the architects of her ruin, or been grateful to him as the one who finally sheltered her, or felt, as is likeliest, some uneasy mixture of both. We cannot know. But there is something poignant in the thought of the old woman living out her dependent years under the roof and the authority of the man whose boyhood she had once overseen. The wheel of their fortunes having turned so completely that the lady of the house had become the dependent, and the boy of the household had become the lord. It is a vivid image of how thoroughly the world could overturn the order of things in that age, how the great could be brought low and the dependent raised high, how a woman who had once held a boy's upbringing in her hands could end by holding out her own hands for his charity. The wheel of fortune was the great image of that age, the wheel that lifted men up and cast them down, and few lives turned upon it more completely than Anne's, who had ridden it to the summit and been carried by it all the way back down to the bottom, and who lived, at the last, on the sufferance of a man she had known when he was a child in her own hall. The first of those griefs came with the death of her elder daughter Isabel, the girl who had been born to Anne in the year of her own new countesshood, who had been married amid revolt to a royal duke, who had borne the loss of her firstborn upon the storm-tossed sea, did not live to grow old. Isabel died young in the year 1476, worn down, it seems, by the strains of childbearing and the hard road her short life had travelled, leaving behind young ones and a husband whose own ruin was not far off. She had survived so much, this mother, and her reward for surviving was to go on living while those she loved were taken from her one by one. The pattern of her life was growing terribly clear. Anne Beauchamp was the one who remained, the one who endured, the one left standing to mourn over the graves of everyone around her. To lose one's offspring is in any age among the heaviest sorrows a human being can be asked to bear. A reversal of the natural order that the heart never quite accepts. Parents are meant to die before their sons and daughters. When it happens the other way, something in the proper shape of things is broken. And Anne would have this grief not once but twice, burying both the children she had borne and raised. Isabel was the first. The girl had been Anne's firstborn. The child who came to her in the very year her own great fortune fell to her, the daughter whose birth and her own elevation were bound together in memory. She had raised Isabel for greatness, had seen her married to a royal duke, had watched her suffer the loss of her own first child upon that terrible sea, and now she had to bury her, dead at 25, worn out by the hard road her short life had run. There is a special cruelty in a death like that, the death of a grown child who has known so much trouble and so little peace, taken before she could come into any calm or settled happiness. For Anne, it was the loss of the elder of the two lives that had been the centre of her own, the breaking of a bond that reached back to the beginning of her greatness and her grief alike. And it came while Anne herself was diminished and dependent, with little power even to order her daughter's mourning as she might have wished. A robbed and reduced old woman grieving a daughter dead too young, the pattern of her life pressed down on her once more. That she was the one who remained, the one who buried others. The survivor whose grim distinction was to outlive those she loved. Isabel was gone, the first of her children to go before her, and Anne, who had already buried so many, now learned the particular and unnatural grief of a mother standing at her own child's grave. There is a question that haunts the long survival of a woman like Anne, and it is worth asking gently, namely, what it does to a person to outlive everyone they love. She buried, across her life, her father and her brother and her infant niece, her first grandchild, her husband, both her daughters, and one of her sons-in-law. And she lived on past the deaths of kings and the fall of the whole world she had known. To survive is one thing. To survive that loss heaped on loss across decades is something the heart can scarcely be imagined to bear. We do not know how Anne carried it, for of her grief she left no record. But we may guess that survival of that kind exacts a heavy and a hidden price, that to go on living while all around you are taken is its own slow sorrow, a loneliness that deepens with each fresh loss until one stands, at the last almost alone, the keeper of memories no one else now shares. There is a particular desolation reserved for the great survivors, the ones who outlast their whole generation, and Anne knew it as few have known it. She had the strength to endure. That strength was her great gift and her salvation. But endurance is not the same as happiness, and to outlive one's age is not the same as to triumph over it. Anne survived, and survival was something, was even, in its way, a victory. But it was a victory bought with a lifetime of grief, paid for in the burial of nearly everyone she had ever loved. And the old woman, who lived on at the end, robbed and dispossessed, and alone had earned her survival at a cost that few would willingly pay. We should honour her endurance, for it was real and rare and hard won. But we should not mistake it for a happy ending, for there was little happiness in it. Only the grim, magnificent persistence of a woman who would not be destroyed, going on and on through an age that took everything from her, but her own unbreakable will to endure. It is worth reflecting on the peculiar legal position of a widow in that age. For in theory, widowhood offered a woman a measure of independence she could enjoy at no other stage of her life, and the cruelty of Anne's case lies partly in how completely she was denied even that. Under the law, a wife was largely absorbed into her husband. Her property lay in his hands to administer, her legal personality folded into his. But a widow stood, in principle, on her own. She could hold property in her own name, make her own decisions, manage her own affairs, free at last from the authority of a husband. For many women, widowhood was the one season of real autonomy in lives otherwise governed entirely by men, fathers and husbands and sons. She should, by every measure, have enjoyed exactly that independence when her husband died. She was a countess in her own person. The great inheritance was hers by blood. As a widow, she should have come into the full and free possession of her own lands and her own life at last. Instead, at the very moment when the law should have made her independent, she was robbed of everything, declared dead, stripped of the autonomy that widowhood ought to have given her. There is an extra cruelty in that the one stage of life which offered a woman some freedom was for Anne the stage at which she was most completely dispossessed. The widowhood that should have been her liberation became instead her deepest imprisonment, the years of sanctuary and dependence and legal erasure. She was denied not only her inheritance, but the independence that should have come with her widowed state, robbed of the one freedom her world might have allowed her. And when, at the very end, she finally asserted herself, pressing her claim against the Tudor king, she was reaching, in a sense, for the independence that should have been hers all along. The freedom of a widow to her own property and her own life, denied her for so many years by the men who had stolen what was hers. It was a small and late reclaiming of a freedom that her widowhood should have granted her from the start, and that the cruelty of her age and her enemies had withheld. The next of the deaths that emptied her world was of a different kind, for it was no natural passing, but an execution, and it removed the elder of the two sons-in-law who had divided her inheritance. The Duke of Clarence, the husband of the dead Isabel, had never ceased his restless scheming, and at last his treasons and his quarrels with his royal brother exhausted the king's patience. He was arrested, condemned, and put to death within the Tower, in the year 1478, by a method that rumour painted in lurid colours. But that was, however it was done, the deliberate killing of a brother by a brother's command. His fall did not restore anything to Anne. The lands he had taken passed to his young son, not back to the grandmother who had been robbed to provide them. But it was one more death in the circle around her, one more of the great and powerful figures of her life brought low, while she, the dispossessed old woman, went on. There is a grim justice in the fall of Clarence that Anne, watching from her diminished corner of the world, can hardly have failed to register, however complicated her feelings. Here was one of the two men who had carved up her living inheritance, who had treated her as a corpse for the convenience of his greed, who had wrangled over her lands while she sat robbed and helpless in sanctuary. He had been one of the architects of the great wrong done to her, and now he himself was brought down, not by any act of hers, but by his own restless treachery, condemned and put to death by the brother whose patience he had finally exhausted. The robber was robbed of his own life. The man who had helped to declare her dead went to a real death of his own. Whatever satisfaction Anne might have taken in that, and she would have been more than human to take none. It was a cold and complicated satisfaction, for Clarence was also the husband of her dead Isabel, the father of grandchildren she loved, a thread, however unwelcome, in the fabric of her own family. His death restored nothing to her. The lands he had taken did not come back to her hands, but passed to his young son. But it removed from the world one of those who had done her such wrong, and it was one more turn of the same wheel that had carried off her husband and would carry off, in time, very nearly everyone who had played a part in her long tragedy. The mighty were falling now, one after another, the men who had seemed so powerful and so untouchable, brought low by the same merciless forces that governed all their lives. And Anne, the dispossessed old woman whom they had all overlooked, went on, watching them fall, enduring, remaining. There is a lesson in that, about who truly survives the storms of history. Not always the mightiest, but sometimes the most patient, the ones who simply outlast the violence that consumes the great. Her younger daughter's fate was the most dazzling, and, in the end, the most heartbreaking of all. For Anne's namesake, her surviving child rose higher than anyone in the family had ever risen. So Anne Beauchamp outlived her second daughter too, the last of her children, laid in the earth like all the rest. She had brought two daughters into the world and raised them for greatness, and she had lived to see them both laid in their graves. The younger one, a crowned Queen of England, dead before her own mother. There can be few crueler fates for any parent than to bury every one of one's children. Anne had now done exactly that. Pause on the dizzying height that the younger daughter reached, for it makes the fall from it all the more terrible. Anne's own child, the girl she had born and raised, and seen married off first to a Lancastrian prince and then to a Yorkist duke, became Queen of England, anointed with holy oil and crowned in the Abbey at Westminster, the wife of a reigning king. It was the very summit of the long ladder her family had been climbing for 2 generations. The goal toward which Anne's husband had bent his whole ferocious life reached at last, though not by him and not by any road he could have foreseen. Anne Beauchamp, the dispossessed old woman living on sufferance, was now the mother of a queen. One might imagine that this, at least, was a triumph she could savour, a vindication after all her sufferings, her own blood raised to the very crown. But the triumph turned to ashes almost as soon as it was won. The young queen had never been strong, worn down like her sister by the hard road of her life, and within months of her crowning her only child, Anne's grandson, the boy who embodied the whole future of the line, sickened and died. And the queen herself, broken by that loss and by her own failing health, did not long survive him, dying young in the spring of the year, the crown slipping from her after she had worn it for less than 2 years. So the dazzling summit proved a precipice. Anne had lived to see her daughter become a queen, and she had lived too, to see that same daughter laid in her grave, the second of her children to die before her, and a crowned Queen of England at that. The height the family had climbed toward for so long was reached, and at the top there was nothing but death, a dead grandson, a dead queen, and an old woman left alive to grieve them both. If ever a life illustrated the emptiness of worldly greatness, it was this, that the supreme triumph and the final desolation arrived together in the same handful of months, and that the mother who had borne the queen outlived the crown itself. There is a small but telling detail about Anne's obscurity in these years, and it concerns her absence from the very summit of her family's fortunes. When her younger daughter was crowned Queen of England, the grandest occasion her blood had ever reached, the moment toward which the whole long ambition of the family had been climbing, she herself was not there. The mother of the new queen, the woman whose inheritance had founded that greatness, was so far sunk in her dispossessed obscurity that she had no place at her own daughter's coronation. Think of what that absence meant. The crowning of her daughter should have been Anne's vindication, the moment when all her sufferings might have seemed redeemed by the elevation of her own child to the throne. Instead, she was a forgotten figure, a dispossessed old woman of no account, overlooked even at the supreme triumph of her own family. Her presence, neither required nor, it seems, much desired. The Queen was her daughter. The crown rested on a head that Anne had brought into the world and raised, and yet she stood outside it all, robbed of her lands and her status, and even of her place at the great events of her own blood. It is a stark measure of how completely she had been set aside, that she could be the mother of the Queen of England and yet be absent and forgotten at the coronation, a ghost at the feast of her family's glory. The greatness she had given her family flowered at last into a crown, and the woman who had given it was not even there to see. Shut out by her dispossession from the triumph her own inheritance had made possible. Few things capture the cruelty of her later years more sharply than that. The founder of the family's fortunes, uninvited and overlooked, while her daughter was crowned with the greatness that had flowed, at the start, from Anne's own blood. The final blow came in the late summer of 1485, near a Midland town called Bosworth, on a field where the fate of the crown would be decided. There the husband of Anne's dead daughter, the king who had risen so high, met an invader who had come to challenge him for the crown, and there he was defeated and killed, the last king of his line, under whose house Anne's family had climbed so high and fallen so far. With his death, the long wars guttered out for good, and the crown passed to a wholly new royal house, the Tudors. For her, watching from the obscurity into which she had sunk, the battle at Bosworth marked the final end of the world she had known. The husband had died years before. Both daughters were in their graves. The sons-in-law had perished. The king who had been her grandson's father was slain, and the cause and the dynasty to which her whole life had been bound were finished. Everyone, it seemed, was gone. The great storm that had carried away her family, one by one across the long years, had finally spent itself, and Anne alone was left, an old woman of nearly 60, the last survivor of a vanished world, outliving not only every member of her own family, but the very age in which they had all lived and died. She had been born the daughter of a mighty earl in the reign of one royal house. She would die in the reign of a dynasty that had not even existed when her tragedy began. The whole pageant of her life, all its greatness and all its grief, had passed away before her, and still she remained, the keeper now of nothing but memory, the witness who had outlasted everything she had witnessed. Think of all that this one woman had witnessed across her long life, for she was a living thread through one of the most eventful stretches of the English past. She was born while the long French wars still flickered in the reign of a king whose own father had won a famous victory in France. She watched the slow loss of those French lands, the gathering troubles at home, the descent into civil war. She saw crowns made and unmade, saw the throne change hands again and again, saw battle after battle fought across the country around her. She witnessed the rise of her own husband to a power that overshadowed the crown, and his fall in the fog at Barnet. She endured the brief restoration of a deposed king and his final destruction, through the reign of the brother-in-law of her own daughter, through the strange dark business of an usurpation and the vanishing of princes, through her daughter's elevation to the throne and her swift death, and at last through the coming of an entirely new dynasty. A single human life spanned all of that, from the old world of the French wars to the dawn of the Tudor age. And she lived through every year of it, a witness to the whole vast turning of her century. Few people see so much history pass before them. Fewer still are so closely caught up in it, standing near the centre of event after event, related by blood or marriage to half the great players in the drama. She was not merely a spectator of her age. She was woven into its very fabric, her family at the heart of its convulsions, her own life rising and falling with the great tides of the time. and she outlasted it all, the whole turning century, living on into a new age as the last witness of an old one, carrying in her memory a span of history that had swept away everything she had known. To have lived through so much, and survived it, and remembered it, is itself a kind of distinction, and she possessed it as few ever have, the distinction of the great witness, the one who was there, who saw it all, and who lived to the end to tell it, had anyone thought to ask her. In her old age, with the new Tudor king upon the throne, Anne made her last attempt to reclaim a part of what had been taken from her. Once more she found herself in sanctuary at Beaulieu, the same abbey that had sheltered her in her first widowhood, and from there she petitioned the new king, Henry VII, for the restoration of the lands that were hers by birthright, the inheritance of which she had been robbed by the legal fiction of her own death. And the king gave her something, though far from everything. He rescinded, at last, the monstrous act that had declared her dead, acknowledging that the living woman was indeed alive. He restored to her a portion of her estates, and granted her a pension to live on. But there was a hard condition. She was required to make over the bulk of her recovered inheritance to the king himself, so that her patrimony, the fortune of the Beauchamps and the Despensers, passed in the end not to her heirs, but into the hands of the Tudor king. It was a small justice, late and incomplete, but it was something. There is something quietly magnificent about this last act of Anne's life, and it deserves to be honoured, for it shows the steel that had been in her all along. Here was a woman of nearly 60, who had been robbed of everything, declared legally dead, stripped of her lands and her status, who had buried her husband and both her children, and watched her whole world pass away. By every measure she was beaten, a broken old woman with nothing left. And yet she did not simply surrender to her fate. She gathered herself, and she pressed her claim, insisting against a wary new king that she was alive, that the lands were hers by right, that the monstrous wrong done to her ought to be put right. It would have been the easiest thing in the world for her to give up, to accept that the law had erased her and that her inheritance was gone for good. Instead, she fought on, with the only means left to a powerless old woman, persistence and the justice of her cause. And she wrung from the new king at least an acknowledgement that she lived, and a portion of what was hers. It was not a full victory, it was far from it. The king exacted a hard price, requiring her to sign over the bulk of her recovered lands to the crown, so that her great inheritance passed at last, not to her heirs, but to the king himself. She recovered a sliver and surrendered the rest. And the fortune that had made her family great vanished forever into the royal hands. But she had forced the law to admit that she was alive. She had refused, to the very end, to accept the erasure that had been imposed on her. There is a real dignity in that. The dignity of a woman who would not be written out of her own existence, who insisted on her own reality against the power of kings. Beaten she may have been, robbed she certainly was, but she did not go quietly, and the old countess who pressed her rights against a Tudor king was the same resilient woman who had endured every other blow her life had dealt. She lost the lands, but she won back her name and her life, and the acknowledgement that she had ever existed at all, and for a woman who had been declared dead, that was no small thing to reclaim. It is worth being clear about what the final settlement actually meant, for the bargain Anne struck with the Tudor king was, beneath its appearance of justice, a kind of last dispossession dressed as a restoration. In form, the king restored her. He undid the monstrous act that had declared her dead, granted her back her estates, acknowledged her as the living holder of her inheritance. But in substance, he required her to hand the bulk of that inheritance straight back to himself, so that the lands she was granted in the morning, as it were, she signed away to the crown by the afternoon. It was a legal sleight of hand, a way of seeming to right the old wrong, while in fact completing the transfer of her fortune into the king's own coffers. The new dynasty got the Beauchamp and Despencer lands. The vast inheritance that had made her family great, she got her legal existence back, a pension to live on, and the cold comfort of having been acknowledged alive before being relieved of nearly everything once more. One might call it justice, of a sort, for it did restore her status and gave her enough to live out her days. But it was justice that cost her the very thing the injustice had taken, the inheritance itself, which passed now not back to her heirs, but forward into the hands of the crown, lost to her family forever. The great fortune that had drawn the whole storm of her life down upon her ended not with her descendants, but with the king, swallowed up by the new dynasty that had risen from the wreckage of the wars. There is a bleak completeness in that ending. The inheritance that had made the family, that had been fought over and stolen and divided and legislated away, came to rest at last in the hands of a king. And the family that had risen upon it kept, in the end, nothing of it at all. There is one more irony worth pausing on, and it concerns the fact that mother and daughter were both called Anne. The younger of them, the Queen, is remembered, written of, given her place in the histories as the consort of a famous king, while the elder, who gave her that very name and the royal blood that came with it, is all but forgotten. The two women were called the same. One is known and one is not. And the one remembered is remembered partly for marrying into the very drama that destroyed her mother's fortunes. There is something poignant in that doubling, the famous queen and her forgotten parent, each bearing the self-same name, the younger woman's small fame casting the elder further into shadow. People who know of the consort, who have read of her in the histories of her royal husband, very often do not know that the mother who bore her lived a far longer and in some ways far harder life, and outlasted her by years. The fame survives in the Queen. The woman who first carried their shared name has faded almost entirely from view. It is a small thing, this matter of a single word held between them, but it captures in miniature the whole injustice of the elder woman's obscurity, that even what she was called lives on attached to someone else, the daughter who reached the throne, while she herself, the source of the blood and the greatness, has slipped into the long forgetting. To restore her, even a little, is to give it back to the woman who carried it first and longest, and through the most, the mother, the survivor, who deserves to be known in her own person, and not merely glimpsed behind the brilliant daughter who took, however innocently, her small share of the light. There is a quiet poignancy in where she came to rest. She was buried at Beauchamp Abbey, and she was laid beside her husband, the man to whom she had been married as a child of 10, and from whom death had parted her on the field at Barnet more than 20 years before. They had been wed as children, had grown up into their union, had risen together to the summit of the kingdom, and fallen together into ruin. Then he had died in the fog, and she had lived on for 2 decades and more. A widow for longer than many marriages last. And now at the very end she was brought to lie beside him again. The two of them reunited in the earth after all the long years of her solitary endurance. There is a rightness in it, that the woman who had begun her life, joined to him as a child, should end it, joined to him once more. The long parenthesis of her widowhood closed at last. Whatever their union had been across the decades of triumph and disaster, she kept faith with him to the end, returning to his side in death as she had been given to it in childhood. The grave at Beauchamp gathered them both in, at last, the Kingmaker and the heiress whose blood had made him, lying together in the quiet after all the storms had passed. Beauchamp Abbey, where Anne was laid, was no random resting place, but a house long bound up with her family, a place of memory and burial for the line into which she had married, and there is meaning in her coming to rest there. To be buried with one's own, in the ground hallowed by the bones of one's kin, was a thing of deep importance to the people of that age, who thought much on death and on the company they would keep in it. For all that Anne had been stripped of in life, her lands and her status, and very nearly her legal existence, she was not denied this last dignity, a grave with her own people beside her husband, in a house that held the dead of her line. It was, perhaps, the one thing the storms of her life could not take from her, the place of her burial and the fellowship of her own in death. There is a quiet consolation in that, for a woman who had lost so much, that she came at the last to rest where she belonged, gathered in among her kindred, no longer a dispossessed stranger, but a daughter and wife of the house, home at last in the ground. For Anne, Beauchamp was simply home, the family's resting place, the ground that received her at the end of her hard road. And there she was laid, beside the husband of her childhood, in the company of her line, in the only kind of homecoming that was left to her. After a life of being moved about and shut out and stripped away, she came home at the last to the grave, and was gathered in, and was at peace among her own. There is a melancholy postscript to her resting place that she could not have foreseen, and was spared from knowing. The old religious houses of England, the abbeys and priories that had stood for centuries and held the bones of the highborn dead, did not endure. Within a few generations of Anne's death, in the sweeping religious changes that remade the country, these houses were dissolved, their lands seized, their buildings stripped and abandoned and left to fall into ruin. Beauchamp itself, the house that received Anne and her husband, and so many of their kin, did not survive that vast upheaval intact. The tombs of those who lay there, the monuments and the bones of generations, were caught up in the general destruction, the resting places of the mighty disturbed and scattered as the old religious order was swept away. So even Anne's grave, the one last dignity that her hard life had not denied her, did not remain undisturbed forever. The very ground that received her was, within a few generations, given over to ruin. There is a strange and fitting sadness in that, for it means that the woman who was declared dead while she lived, who was robbed and dispossessed and erased, was in the end denied even the permanence of her own grave, her resting place caught up in the great destruction that came after her. And yet there is, perhaps, a kind of consolation in it too. Anne had learned, across her long life, that nothing in this life is permanent, that fortunes rise and fall, that the greatest houses can be brought to nothing, that even graves are not safe from the turning of the wheel. She, of all people, would not have been surprised that her resting place shared the fate of everything else she had known, swept away in its turn by the changes of an age that never stood still. She had outlived her own age once already, in her lifetime. It was perhaps only fitting that her grave should outlive its own time too, and pass, like everything else she had known, into the long silence of the vanished past. Here, then, the long and difficult life of Anne Beauchamp, Countess of Warwick, draws to its close. She died in obscurity in the autumn of 1492, having reached the age of 66, in a world that had all but forgotten she existed. What are we to make of her? This woman who began with everything and ended with almost nothing, who carried in her blood the fortune that shook a kingdom, and who outlived every soul that fortune touched. She was, by any measure, one of the supreme survivors of her age. She endured what would have broken most: the loss of her father and her brother and her niece, the loss of her first grandchild upon a storm-tossed sea, the death of her husband and the ruin of his cause, the theft of her entire inheritance by a law that called her dead, the burial of both her daughters, one of them a crowned queen, and the final extinction of her whole world at Bosworth. Through all of it she endured, neither broken nor defeated, pressing her rights to the very end, dying at last in her own bed and in her own name. A living woman who had outlasted even her own legal death. The men of her age won the battles and lost their heads. The mighty lords rose like rockets and fell like stones. Anne Beauchamp did neither. She simply survived, year after year after year, outlasting them all, the quiet still centre around which the whole bloody storm of her age revolved and finally died away. There is a kind of grandeur in that endurance, less glittering than her husband's, but far more durable, the strength of the one who remains. There is a final irony in the manner of her death that is worth marking, for it completes the strange shape of her life. She passed quietly in her bed, of age rather than violence. In the autumn of her 67th year, an old woman in a still house, attended by whatever small household remained to her, slipping out of a world that had long since ceased to take much notice of her at all. After so many storms, such rises and falls, such dramatic reversals of fortune, she went out as softly as a candle guttering in an empty room. There were no crowds, no great mourning, no chroniclers gathering to record the passing of a famous woman. For the world had forgotten that she was famous, or that she had ever been great. She went as she had lived her last years, in obscurity, overlooked, a forgotten figure from a vanished age. And yet there is a strange dignity in that peaceful ending. In an age when so many of the great met violent ends, in battle or beneath the axe, she went peacefully in her bed, of nothing worse than the weight of her years. It was perhaps the gentlest thing her hard years had granted her, this gentle and natural death, and in a family marked for violent ends, it was a rare mercy. The woman who had been declared dead while she lived came, at the very last, to a real death that was kinder than her years had been, slipping away in peace after all her storms. There are worse ways to end a road as hard as hers had been, and the peace of her death was, in its way, a final and unexpected grace. Before we leave her to her rest, let us dwell a little on what that endurance of hers truly meant. For there is a temptation to tell such a story as a simple catalogue of misfortunes, one grief heaped upon another, and to lose sight of the woman beneath them. Anne Beauchamp was not merely a victim of her age, though the age used her cruelly. She was a person of real substance, intelligent and capable and resilient, who kept a vast inheritance in good order through decades of turmoil, who raised two daughters for the brilliant and terrible destinies they were born to, and who, when everything was stripped from her, did not simply fade away in despair, but went on, pressed her rights, insisted upon her own existence against a law that denied it, and lived to die in her own name with what dignity she could reclaim. Hers was not the loud glory of the field of war and the seat of power, the kind that fills the pages of the chronicles. It was the quieter triumph of survival, of carrying what could not be carried and going on regardless, of outliving every blow that fell. We remember her husband, the Kingmaker, the man who shook the throne. The chronicles are full of him. We are apt to forget the wife whose blood made him, who watched him rise and watched him fall, and went on living for more than 20 years after the fog at Barnet swallowed him. Yet there is an argument that her life is the more remarkable, precisely because it is a tale of endurance rather than of conquest. The story of the one who was meant to be forgotten and who refused quietly and stubbornly to disappear. She carried a proud name and a vast fortune through the worst that her age could do. And though the fortune was seized and the name nearly forgotten, the woman herself endured to the end. Anne was not the only woman of her generation to survive the wars by sheer endurance, and it is worth setting her beside her peers, for the age produced a remarkable company of formidable survivors. Hers was a generation in which the men killed one another with terrible regularity in battle and on the scaffold, and the women were left to carry on, to hold families together, to preserve what could be preserved, to outlast the violence that consumed their husbands and sons. Across the great houses of England in those years, there were women who buried husband after husband, son after son, and went on. Women who held estates and raised heirs and schemed and waited and survived through decades of bloodshed. Women whose endurance was the thread that held the broken families of the nobility together. She belongs in that company, among the great survivor women of that violent age, and her life, terrible as it is not unique but representative. One telling of a fate that many women of her rank shared in some measure. There is a kind of unsung heroism in that whole generation of women, who endured what the conflict dealt them and kept the families going while the men destroyed themselves, and whom the chroniclers, fixed on the battles, have too often passed over in silence. To recall Anne is, in a sense, to recall all of them, the survivor women of those years, the ones who waited and endured and held on, who buried their dead and raised the next generation, and kept the thread of continuity unbroken through the worst that their age could do. They are among the true and unsung heroes of that violent time, and she, who endured more than most and survived longer than almost any, stands fairly at the head of their forgotten company. It is worth asking why a woman so central to the momentous events of her age should have been so thoroughly lost to memory, for the answer says much about whose stories get remembered and whose are allowed to fade. Anne's husband is famous. Whole books are written of him. The name the world gave him, the Kingmaker, has echoed down the centuries as one of the great titles of English history. And Anne, whose inheritance made him, whose blood was the foundation of his power, who survived him by more than 2 decades and endured more than he ever did, is a footnote known to specialists, unknown to the general memory of the past. And one may ask why. Partly because she was a woman, and history has always been readier to remember the men who fought the battles than the women who suffered their consequences. Partly because her husband's career was dramatic and public, full of the battles and betrayals that chroniclers love, while hers was a story of endurance, of suffering borne in private, of survival rather than conquest. The kind of story that the histories find harder to tell, and partly perhaps because her very survival was a quiet thing, undramatic, a matter of going on rather than of striking out, easy to overlook beside the blazing rise and fall of her famous husband. But there is an injustice in the forgetting, for Anne's story is, in its way, as remarkable as his, and arguably more so, since it is harder to endure than to conquer, harder to survive a catastrophe than to cause one. The Kingmaker shook a kingdom and died in the fog at Barnet, at the height of his drama. Anne lived on through every loss that kingdom could inflict, and survived, and pressed her rights to the end, and died old and unbroken in her bed. If endurance is a kind of greatness, and it is, then she possessed it more fully than her famous husband ever did. And it is a strange injustice that the man who shook the throne should be remembered, while the woman who outlasted the wreckage of his ambitions should be forgotten. There is a broader truth in her obscurity that is worth naming, for it reaches beyond Anne to the whole way we remember the past. History, as it has mostly been written, is a record of action, of the things that men did, the battles and the treaties and the seizures of power. It is far less a record of endurance, of the things that were suffered and borne and survived, which was so often the province of women. And so the men who acted have come down to us in vivid detail, while the women who endured have faded into the margins, remembered, if at all, only in relation to the men, as wives and mothers and daughters, rather than as people in their own right. Anne is a perfect example of this imbalance. Her husband acted and is famous. She endured and is forgotten. Yet her endurance was, by any honest measure, the greater feat harder to sustain and longer to bear than his blaze of action. To recover her story is to push, in a small way, against that old imbalance, to insist that the ones who suffered and survived deserve remembering as much as the ones who fought and fell. It is to say that endurance is as worthy of memory as action, that the woman who outlasted the catastrophe matters as much as the man who caused it, that the quiet heroism of survival deserves its place in the record, alongside the loud heroism of the battlefield. This is not to diminish her husband or the men of action, it is only to widen the frame, to make room in our memory for the women who held the world together while the men tore it apart. She belongs in that widened frame, restored from the margins to her rightful place as a figure of real significance. The heiress whose blood made a kingmaker, and the survivor who outlived him and everything he built. Her tale is worth telling, not in spite of its quietness, but because of it. For it reminds us that history is made of endurance as well as action, and that the forgotten survivors deserve their remembrance too. There is one final thread worth drawing out before we leave her, and it reaches forward beyond her own death into the fates of those who came after. For the blood of Anne Beauchamp, the royal and ancient blood she had carried from her dispenser mother and passed to her daughters, did not bring good fortune to her descendants any more than it had to her. It proved, in the generations after her, a kind of curse, marking those who bore it for the suspicion and the vengeance of kings. She had survived everything, and survival in that murderous age was no small achievement. She outlived her enemies and her friends, her husband and her children, her fortune and very nearly her own legal existence. And she came at the last to a peaceful grave beside the man she had wed as a child. After a life of such storms, that stillness was perhaps its own kind of mercy. It is worth telling the fate of those descendants in a little more detail, for it completes the dark pattern of her story and shows how the very blood that had exalted her family became its undoing. Her grandson, the son of her elder daughter Isabel, was the boy who by rights should have inherited the earldom of Warwick and all the consequence of the Beauchamp name. But he had the misfortune to be born with too much royal blood in his veins, a possible claimant to the throne in an age when such claimants were not suffered to live freely. He was taken as a child and shut away in the tower, kept a prisoner year after year for no crime but his birth, growing to manhood behind those walls. His life a long confinement, decreed by kings who feared what his blood might mean. And in the end, on a charge that was very likely contrived, he was brought out and put to death. The last male of the direct line extinguished on the scaffold, a young man who had spent almost his whole life a prisoner and died for the accident of his ancestry. Her granddaughter lived far longer, into a great old age, and seemed to have escaped the curse of her blood. But it caught her at the last. In her old age, decades after Anne's own death, she too was condemned and executed by a Tudor king grown suspicious of the old royal lines. An elderly woman dragged to a brutal death for the blood she carried, the same blood that ran back through Anne to the Despensers and the old royal house. So the inheritance that Anne had carried, the proud blood of her ancestors, proved a deadly gift to those who received it after her, marking them out across the generations for the suspicion and the vengeance of kings. There is a bleak irony in it, that the very thing which had made her family great, the royal and ancient blood, became in the end the thing that destroyed her descendants one by one. And it casts her own quiet death in a strange light, for she, who had suffered so much, was spared at least this. She died in her bed, of age and not the axe, which in her blighted family was a rarer mercy than it should ever have had to be. There is a symmetry to her life that is worth holding in the mind as we take our leave of her, the symmetry of its beginning and its end. She was born at Caversham, a castle by a river in the green heart of England, the daughter of one of the greatest men in the land, born to wealth and consequence and the bright expectations of a great house. And she died at Beauchamp, an old woman in the shelter of an abbey, robbed of nearly all that wealth and consequence, her great house fallen, her family destroyed, dying in obscurity in a land that had forgotten her. Between that bright beginning and that dim ending lay the whole long arc of her days, the rise to unimaginable greatness and the fall to almost nothing, the triumph and the catastrophe, the wealth and the dispossession, the husband and the children gained and lost. Few lives travel so far from their starting point, or end so far from where they began. The infant born to greatness at Caversham could not have been imagined to end as the dispossessed old widow of Beauchamp, declared dead in law, outliving everyone she knew. And yet that was the journey her life made, from the cradle of a great fortune to the grave of a forgotten survivor, across more than 60 years of some of the most turbulent history her country ever knew. It is a far road from Caversham to Beauchamp, from the bright morning of her birth to the quiet dusk of her death, and Anne walked every step of it, enduring what came, outlasting what fell, until she reached at last the rest she had earned 100 times over. Let her have it now, that rest, after so long and hard a road. So let us leave her there, in the calm at the end of it all, an old woman who had seen the wheel of fortune turn full circle and had outlasted every turn of it. Let the castles and the battlefields and the council chambers fade now into the dark, the storms all stilled, the wars over. The whole bright and bloody pageant of her age sunk down at last into the quiet of the past where it belongs. Let the grey walls of Beauchamp close softly around her, and the husband of her childhood lie beside her, and the long, hard, extraordinary life of Anne Beauchamp come at last to its rest. There is nothing left now that can trouble her, no more news to dread, no more losses to bear, no more rights to plead. It is all behind her, and she is at peace. If these long, quiet journeys into the lives of the people who lived in the shadow of the crown are something you would care to share again, you are warmly welcome to subscribe, with no pressure at all. And another of these evenings will find its way to you when the time is right. For now, though, the hour is late, and there is nothing more to do but let it all go and rest. Thank you, as always, for spending these few hours of the night in my company. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.